Artifacts of Horror, Volume 2. 6 nightmarish shorts, focusing on unsettling objects and curios. The Toad Idol by Kirk Mashburn. The thing, the toad, comes from a small, ruined Aztec temple in central Mexico. My standing as an archaeologist has not come unearned, and I know that none of the Aztec gods was represented by a toad, nor does evidence exist that the reptile had any other sacred significance in their religious symbolism. Yet this one occupied the place of honor in the temple, and except for it there was no image in the ruins. The thing struck me with an odd loathing, a sense of dread and oppression, almost at sight. As for my Indian workmen, they were persuaded to enter the temple only with difficulty. No explanation was obtainable, but their terror of the place was manifest. When I removed the toad from its pedestal overlooking a small altar, they grovelled on the ground in abject misery, frantically beseeching me to leave the image undisturbed. It was nothing but a small, curved piece of obsidian stone, though I have already admitted the malignant impression I received from it. Yet I strongly suspect that, had I not been formidably armed, the Indians would have forcibly compelled me to leave it untouched. I would to God they had done so. Overcome by a perverse fascination for the thing, notwithstanding my dislike of toads and reptiles in any form, to say nothing of my steadily mounting, if then unreasoning repugnance for the thing, I smuggled out the amphibian idol upon my return to this country, circumventing the Mexican laws which prohibit exportation of archaeological objects. Who has not experienced similar attraction for some very thing that repels and disgusts, even while it fascinates? So, in my case with this toad, instead of turning it over to the museum, I placed it upon the writing desk in my study. Each passing day has added to my repugnance, but now, finally, something of the horror and terror of those Indians has succeeded my former mere loathing. For the toad has come alive. It deserts my desk by night, to sit upon the floor looking at the windows, waiting for God alone knows what. As I write, I feel the beady eyes of the accursed reptile, the loathsome mottled toad, burning into my back from where it squats behind me in a corner of this room. It is but a common, ordinary toad to all appearances, and that is what lends it the significance of a small but horrific monster out of hell, for it should be a thing of carved volcanic obsidian, lifeless upon my desk. I have not even the power to touch it, cast it with loathing through the open window. I have tried once and failed. Whether I am mad or the victim of hallucinations induced by some tropic fever hitherto dormant in my blood, whether I have, in violating the temple of the toad, brought upon my head some dread, nameless curse, I do not know. I am aware only that the figurine monster upon the floor has become an obsession of torment and dread. More than anything else, it is the thing's attitude of waiting. I have lived and worked alone in this house for years. The one servant who attends my scant wants stays only through the day. Thus, as usual, I was alone in my study, resting wearily at my desk upon the evening when the toad first moved. It was dusk, but there was yet enough light for shadowy visibility. Something intruded upon my tired thoughts. Some indistinct prompting impelled me to raise my head and look down to the floor in the nearest corner of the room. It was then that I saw the toad, removed from its place upon my desk, and alive. What I saw was not of itself alarming to other eyes than mine, but I knew the toad, huddled in the corner with its beady eyes meeting my own, for the idol that should have rested upon my desk, the idol come alive. I am naturally neurotic, and the apparition stabbed at every taut nerve in my body. I determined to evict the thing, to throw it out and have done with it once and for all. I rose and, taking a section of newspaper in order to avoid contact of my bare hand with the reptile's loathsome hide, I was convinced the thing was clammily alive. I stooped to take it from the floor and cast it out the window. The toad made no effort to escape as the paper descended, and I gathered it up. I could not feel my captive beneath the several thicknesses of paper, but I had no doubt of its being wrapped in the wood of newsprint I tossed through the window. I turned with a feeling of relief and satisfaction, and there in the corner the toad squatted, as before. With an exclamation of annoyance, I again moved to enfold the reptile in paper, using a small, thin piece. Again it appeared that I had secured the thing, but this time I turned my hand over to make certain. Expecting to see the bloated belly of the creature exposed, I beheld instead nothing but the wadded newspaper. The toad blinked balefully up from the floor at my feet. Stupidly, I stared from the paper in my hand to the toad upon the floor. A third time I essayed to seize the elusive monstrosity, in the same manner as before, and with the same result. I moved then to turn on the lights, as dusk had deepened into night. My hand trembled so violently that I pressed the switch with difficulty. I decided to dispense with the paper and, overcoming my natural repugnance, grasped the toad with my naked hand. Determinedly, I bent down. My fingers swooped to snatch the thing. With a gasp, I straightened, stepped back uncertainly. I had thought to scoop up the toad, but my hand had clutched nothing more than empty air. I laughed. Even in my own ears the sound possessed a startling quality. The thing had been a carven stone toad upon my desk, and had become alive. And now, to my touch, there was no toad. Hallucination, I muttered. I'm seeing things that do not exist. The implications of that conclusion were far from comforting, however, and whatever I might think, or whatever else than a stone idol it might be, there it sat upon the floor, its sardonic eyes unswerving from my face, blinking, waiting. I sat down at the desk, stared back, baffled and afraid, into those cold, glittering eyes. Gradually, sullen rage possessed me. I sprang up furiously and stamped upon the small monster. I fell upon my knees, sought to seize it with my hands, to tear and rend it into nothingness. Each time I lifted my grinding heel, each time I drew back my clawing fingers, the thing was there, gloating up at me with its cold, demon's eyes. Finally, I staggered again to my chair and fell forward across the desk, burying my head in my arms. I awoke in that position, in the chill, grey dawn that succeeded. My first coherent thought moved me to rouse, groaning with misery, and look toward that corner where the accursed toad had huddled the night before. Even in abjection, I found heart to rejoice, for the living creature that had been upon the floor was gone with the night, and the small idol rested in its accustomed place atop my desk, clearly a carved, lifeless piece of obsidian. But chill dread awoke with the sudden thought that life might return with another night. All through that day the apprehension lay like a sombre shadow upon my mind. I left the house, returning after nightfall. When I came to the door of my workroom, I hesitated for long minutes before entering. Groping through the darkness, I switched on the lights. After one fearful, revealing glance, I sank into my chair, utterly abject with terror and despair. For settled in the same corner it had occupied the night before, the toad regarded me with bright, malevolent eyes. If I am mad, I have every reason to be, night after night, for so many nights that it wearies me to number them. I have been stared out of countenance by a fiend in the shape of a malformed toad. Hoping that its manifestations were confined to this room, I have fled the house more than once at night. But wherever I seek to hide, my familiar demon appears with darkness. Seemingly, it has been ages since I have known sleep that was not induced either by drunkenness or soporific drugs. More often than not, neither of these suffices to bring merciful oblivion. Tomorrow, I shall leave this country forever. I have already completed my arrangements. Perhaps if, as I intend, the end of my flight places half the world between us, I shall elude my tormentor. That I am not mad, I have established to my satisfaction by writing this account. Obviously, the effort and orderly thought required for a coherent narrative of this length is outside the scope of a deranged mind. And in the course of this exercise there remains but one further item to be set down. This has to do with the pebbles that have accompanied the idol's latter nightly transformations. I noticed the first of them a little longer than a fortnight ago. Upon each succeeding night, there has been one more pebble, each about the size of a small walnut, added to the growing pile beside the creature. These appear only at night, like the living reptile that squats beside them. They are not on the desk with the lifeless obsidian toad in the daytime. What this addition to the toad's nocturnal animation may portend, I have sought to fathom with growing unease. I have lately recalled that there was a pile of just such pebbles heaped at the foot of the altar in the ancient temple, from which, may God forgive the stupid act, I took the vile toad. Something very dreadful has occurred since I wrote the preceding words. I am impelled to write the few remaining lines that will be necessary or possible by some power, some gleeful and triumphantly malignant force outside of me. While I was writing, I felt a blow upon the back of my head. It was more as if I had been hit forcibly, inside, upon my uncovered brain, by an object thrown from behind my back. For a moment I was unable to move, so great was the pain. Partly recovering, I turned to discover the source of the missile with which I had been struck. Then my blood chilled, seemed truly to freeze in my veins. The toad has moved out of its usual squatting position. About it there is an unfathomable impression of unholy joyousness. I know without understanding that the thing no longer is waiting. Its hour has struck. I wrote that the toad has moved. It stands erect upon its deformed and twisted rear members. Grotesque and unnatural as that is, the circumstance that constricts my heart is that, raised above its head in the act of casting as I turned, the frightful little monster gripped a pebble in its tiny hand-like forefeet. Even as I saw and gasped, the missile hurtled through the air, struck inside my forehead with a stunning impact. The pile of pebbles, those pebbles, the purpose of which I now know, probably is diminished by more than half. At intervals, one of them crashes into the back of my brain. I am paralyzed now, all except, oddly, this arm with which I write. I cannot move aside, seek to evade the battering pebble hail. But I feel that I should not escape, though the power to move, to cry out, still remained to me. All about this room there are intangible rustlings and scurryings. There are things around me, unseen but present, that have come to watch with grim, unhallowed satisfaction as the toad hurls pebbles into my brain. My death, beyond doubt, will be attributed to cerebral hemorrhage. My head, to all outward appearances, will be whole and unmutilated, for the toad's missiles pass unscathing through my skull by some unholy means and batter only upon my brain. I shall die very soon now, beneath the barrage of pebbles cast by the paws of that thing in the corner behind me. I shall die as, in all likelihood, no man ever met death before, stoned to death by a foul, loathsome toad. The Uncommon Prayer Book by M.R. James. 1. Mr. Davidson was spending the first week in January alone, in a country town. A combination of circumstances had driven him to that drastic course. His nearest relations were enjoying winter sports abroad, and the friends who had been kindly anxious to replace them had an infectious complaint in the house. Doubtless he might have found someone else to take pity on him. But, he reflected, most of them have made up their parties, and after all it is only for 3 or 4 days at most that I have to fend for myself, and it will be just as well if I can get a move on with my introduction to the Leaventhorpe papers. I might use the time by going down as near as I can to Galsford and making acquaintance with the neighbourhood. I ought to see the remains of Leaventhorpe House and the tombs in the church. The first day after his arrival at the Swan Hotel at Longbridge was so stormy that he got no farther than the tobacconist's. The next, comparatively bright, he used for his visit to Galsford, which interested him more than a little, but had no ulterior consequences. The third, which was really a pearl of a day for early January, was too fine to be spent indoors. He gathered from the landlord that a favourite practice of visitors in the summer was to take a morning train to a couple of stations westward, and walk back down the valley of the Tent, through Stanford St. Thomas and Stanford Magdalen, both of which were accounted highly picturesque villages. He closed with this plan, and we now find him seated in a third-class carriage at 9:45 a.m., on his way to Kingsbourne Junction, and studying the map of the district. One old man was his only fellow traveller, a piping old man who seemed inclined for conversation. So Mr. Davidson, after going through the necessary versicles and responses about the weather, inquired whether he was going far. "No, sir, not far, not this morning, sir," said the old man. "I ain't only going so far as what they call Kingsbourne Junction. There isn't but 2 stations betwixt here and there. Yes, they calls it Kingsbourne Junction." "I'm going there too," said Mr. Davidson. "Oh, indeed, sir. Do you know that part?" "No, I'm only going for the sake of taking a walk back to Longbridge and seeing a bit of the country." "Oh, indeed, sir. Well, 'tis a beautiful day for a gentleman as enjoys a bit of a walk." "Yes, to be sure. Have you got far to go when you get to Kingsbourne?" "No, sir, I ain't got far to go once I get to Kingsbourne Junction. I'm going to see my daughter, sir. She live at Broxton. That's about 2 miles across the fields from what they call Kingsbourne Junction, that is. You got that marked down on your map, I expect, sir?" "I expect I have. Let me see. Broxton, did you say? Here's Kingsbourne, yes. And which way is Broxton? Toward the Stanfords? Ah, I see it. Broxton Court, in a park. I don't see the village, though." "No, sir, you wouldn't see no village of Broxton. There ain't only the court and the chapel at Broxton." "Chapel? Oh, yes, that's marked here, too. The chapel, close by the court, it seems to be. Does it belong to the court?" "Yes, sir, that's close up to the court, only a step. Yes, that belonged to the court. My daughter, you see, sir, she's the keeper's wife now, and she live at the court and look after things now the family's away." "No one living there now, then?" "No, sir, not for a number of years. The old gentleman, he lived there when I was a lad, and the lady, she lived on after him to very near upon 90 years of age. And then she died, and them that have it now, they've got this other place in Warwickshire, I believe it is, and they don't do nothing about letting the court out. But Colonel Wildman, he have the shooting, and young Mr. Clark, he's the agent. He come over once in so many weeks to see to things, and my daughter's husband, he's the keeper." "And who uses the chapel? Just the people round about, I suppose?" "Oh, no one don't use the chapel. Why, there ain't no one to go. All the people about, they go to Stanford St. Thomas Church. But my son-in-law, he go to Kingsbourne Church now, because the gentleman at Stanford, he have this Gregory sing in him. My son-in-law, he don't like that. He say he can hear the old donkey brain any day of the week, and he likes something a little cheerful on the Sunday." The old man drew his hand across his mouth and laughed. "That's what my son-in-law say. He say he can hear the old donkey," etc. Da capo. Mr. Davidson also laughed as honestly as he could, thinking meanwhile that Broxton Court and Chapel would probably be worth including in his walk, for the map showed that from Broxton he could strike the Tent Valley quite as easily as by following the main Kingsbourne-Longbridge road. So, when the mirth excited by the remembrance of the son-in-law's bon mot had died down, he returned to the charge and ascertained that both the court and the chapel were of the class known as old-fashioned places, and that the old man would be very willing to take him thither, and his daughter would be happy to show him whatever she could. "But that ain't a lot, sir. Not as if the family was living there. All the looking-glasses is covered up, and the paintings, and the curtains and carpets folded away. Not but what I dare say she could show you a pair just to look at, because she go over them to see as the moth shouldn't get into 'em." "I shan't mind about that, thank you. If she can show me the inside of the chapel, that's what I'd like best to see." "Oh, she can show you that right enough, sir. She have the key of the door, you see. And most weeks she go in and dust about. That's a nice chapel, that is. My son-in-law, he say he'll be bound they didn't have none of this Gregory singing there. Dear, I can't help but smile when I think of him saying that about the old donkey. I can hear him bray, say, any day of the week, and so he can, sir. That's true, anyway." The walk across the fields from Kingsbourne to Broxton was very pleasant. It lay for the most part on the top of the country, and commanded wide views over a succession of ridges, plough and pasture, or covered with dark blue woods, all ending more or less abruptly on the right in headlands that overlooked the wide valley of a great western river. The last field they crossed was bounded by a close copse, and no sooner were they in it than the path turned downward very sharply, and it became evident that Broxton was neatly fitted into a sudden and very narrow valley. It was not long before they had glimpses of groups of smokeless stone chimneys and stone-tiled roofs close beneath their feet, and not many minutes after that they were wiping their shoes at the back door of Broxton Court, while the keeper's dogs barked very loudly in unseen places, and Mrs. Porter, in quick succession, screamed at them to be quiet, greeted her father, and begged both her visitors to step in. 2. It was not to be expected that Mr. Davidson should escape being taken through the principal rooms of the court, in spite of the fact that the house was entirely out of commission. Pictures, carpets, curtains, furniture were all covered up or put away, as old Mr. Avery had said, and the admiration which our friend was very ready to bestow had to be lavished on the proportions of the rooms, and on the one painted ceiling, upon which an artist who had fled from London in the plague year had depicted the triumph of loyalty and defeat of sedition. In this Mr. Davidson could show an unfeigned interest. The portraits of Cromwell, Ireton, Bradshaw, Peters, and the rest, writhing in carefully devised torments, were evidently the part of the design to which most pains had been devoted. "That were the old Lady Sadleir had that painting done, same as the one what put up the chapel. They say she were the first that went up to London to dance on Oliver Cromwell's grave." So said Mr. Avery, and continued musingly, "Well, I suppose she got some satisfaction to her mind, but I don't know as I should want to pay the fare to London and back just for that. And my son-in-law, he said the same. He said he don't know as he should have cared to pay all that money only for that. I was telling the gentleman as we came along in the train, Mary, what your Harry says about this Gregory singing down at Stanford here. We had a bit of a laugh over that, sir, didn't us? Yes, to be sure we did. Once again, Mr. Davidson strove to do justice to the pleasantry of the keeper. But, he said, if Mrs. Porter can show me the chapel, I think it should be now, for the days aren't long, and I want to get back to Longbridge before it falls quite dark. Even if Broxton Court has not been illustrated in rural life, and I think it has not, I do not propose to point out its excellences here. But of the chapel a word must be said. It stands about 100 yards from the house, and has its own little graveyard and trees about it. It is a stone building about 70 feet long, and in the Gothic style, as that style was understood in the middle of the 17th century. On the whole, it resembles some of the Oxford College chapels as much as anything, save that it has a distinct chancel like a parish church, and a fanciful domed bell turret at the southwest angle. When the west door was thrown open, Mr. Davidson could not repress an exclamation of pleased surprise at the completeness and richness of the interior. Screenwork, pulpit, seating, and glass, all were of the same period, and as he advanced into the nave and sighted the organ case with its gold-embossed pipes in the western gallery, his cup of satisfaction was filled. The glass in the nave windows was chiefly armorial, and in the chancel were figure subjects of the kind that may be seen at Abbey Door of Lord Scudamore's work. But this is not an archaeological review. While Mr. Davidson was still busy examining the remains of the organ, attributed to one of the Dallams, I believe, old Mr. Avery had stumped up into the chancel, and was lifting the dust cloths from the blue velvet cushions of the stall desks. Evidently it was here that the family sat. Mr. Davidson heard him say in a rather hushed tone of surprise, "Why, Mary, here's all the books open again." The reply was in a voice that sounded peevish rather than surprised. "Well, there, I never." Mrs. Porter went over to where her father was standing, and they continued talking in a lower key. Mr. Davidson saw plainly that something not quite in the common run was under discussion, so he came down the gallery stairs and joined them. There was no sign of disorder in the chancel any more than in the rest of the chapel, which was beautifully clean, but the 8 folio prayer books on the cushions of the stall desks were indubitably open. Mrs. Porter was inclined to be fretful over it. "Whoever can it be as does it?" she said. "For there's no key but mine, nor yet door but the one we came in by, and the windows is barred, every one of 'em. I don't like it, father, that I don't." "What is it, Mrs. Porter? Anything wrong?" said Mr. Davidson. "No, sir, nothing really wrong, only these books. Every time, pretty near, that I come in to do up the place, I shuts 'em and spreads the cloths over 'em to keep off the dust, ever since Mr. Clark spoke about it when I first come. And yet there they are again, and always the same page. And as I says, whoever it can be as does it with the door and windows shut. And as I says, it makes anyone feel queer coming in here alone, as I have to do. Not as I'm given that way myself, not to be frightened easy, I mean to say. And there's not a rat in the place, not as no rat wouldn't trouble to do a thing like that, do you think, sir?" "Hardly, I should say, but it sounds very queer. Are they always open at the same place, did you say?" "Always the same place, sir. One of the Psalms it is. And I didn't particular notice it the first time or two, till I see a little red line of printing, and it's always caught my eye since." Mr. Davidson walked along the stalls and looked at the open books. Sure enough, they all stood at the same page, Psalm CIX, and at the head of it, just between the number and the Deus Laudum, was a rubric for the 25th day of April. Without pretending to minute knowledge of the history of the Book of Common Prayer, he knew enough to be sure that this was a very odd and wholly unauthorized addition to its text, and though he remembered that April 25th is St. Mark's Day, he could not imagine what appropriateness this very savage psalm could have to that festival. With slight misgivings, he ventured to turn over the leaves to examine the title page, and knowing the need for particular accuracy in these matters, he devoted some 10 minutes to making a line-for-line transcript of it. The date was 1653. The printer called himself Anthony Cadman. He turned to the list of proper psalms for certain days. Yes, added to it was that same inexplicable entry. For the 25th day of April, the 109th psalm. An expert would no doubt have thought of many other points to inquire into, but this antiquary, as I have said, was no expert. He took stock, however, of the binding, a handsome one of tooled blue leather, bearing the arms that figured in several of the nave windows in various combinations. "How often," he said at last to Mrs. Porter, "have you found these books lying open like this?" "Really, I couldn't say, sir, but it's a great many times now. Do you recollect, Father, me telling you about it the first time I noticed it?" "That I do, my dear. You was in a rare taking, and I don't so much wonder at it. That was 5 year ago. I was paying you a visit at Michaelmas time, and you come in at tea time, and says you, 'Father, there's the books laying open under the cloths again.' And I didn't know what my daughter was speaking about, you see, sir, and I says, 'Books?' just like that, I says, and then it all came out. But as Harry says, that's my son-in-law, sir, whoever it can be, he says, as does it, because there ain't only the one door, and we keeps the key locked up, he says, and the windows is barred, every one of 'em. Well, he says, I lay once I could catch 'em at it, they wouldn't do it a second time, he says, and no more they wouldn't, I don't believe, sir. Well, that was 5 year ago, and it's been happening constant ever since by your account, my dear. Young Mr. Clark, he don't seem to think much to it. But then he don't live here, you see, and 'tisn't his business to come and clean up here of a dark afternoon, is it?" "I suppose you never notice anything else odd when you're at work here, Mrs. Porter?" said Mr. Davidson. "No, sir, I do not," said Mrs. Porter. "And it's a funny thing to me I don't, with the feeling I have as there's someone sitting there. No, it's the other side, just within the screen, and looking at me all the time I'm dusting in the gallery and pews. But I never yet see nothing worse than myself, as the saying goes, and I kindly hope I never may." 3. In the conversation that followed, there was not much of it. Nothing was added to the statement of the case. Having parted on good terms with Mr. Avery and his daughter, Mr. Davidson addressed himself to his 8-mile walk. The little valley of Broxton soon led him down into the broader one of the Tent, and on to Stanford St. Thomas, where he found refreshment. We need not accompany him all the way to Longbridge, but as he was changing his socks before dinner, he suddenly paused and said, half aloud, "By Jove, that is a rum thing." It had not occurred to him before how strange it was that any edition of the prayer book should have been issued in 1653, 7 years before the Restoration, 5 years before Cromwell's death, and when the use of the book, let alone the printing of it, was penal. He must have been a bold man who put his name and a date on that title page. Only, Mr. Davidson reflected, it probably was not his name at all, for the ways of printers in difficult times were devious. As he was in the front hall of the Swan that evening, making some investigations about trains, a small motor stopped in front of the door, and out of it came a small man in a fur coat, who stood on the steps and gave directions in a rather yapping foreign accent to his chauffeur. When he came into the hotel, he was seen to be black-haired and pale-faced, with a little pointed beard and gold pince-nez, altogether very neatly turned out. He went to his room, and Mr. Davidson saw no more of him till dinner-time. As they were the only two dining that night, it was not difficult for the newcomer to find an excuse for falling into talk. He was evidently wishing to make out what brought Mr. Davidson into that neighborhood at that season. "Can you tell me how far it is from here to Arlingworth?" was one of his early questions, and it was one which threw some light on his own plans, for Mr. Davidson recollected having seen at the station an advertisement of a sale at Arlingworth Hall, comprising old furniture, pictures, and books. This, then, was a London dealer. "No," he said, "I've never been there. I believe it lies out by Kingsbourne. It can't be less than 12 miles. I see there's a sale there shortly." The other looked at him inquisitively, and he laughed. "No," he said, as if answering a question. "You needn't be afraid of my competing. I'm leaving this place tomorrow." This cleared the air, and the dealer, whose name was Homburger, admitted that he was interested in books, and thought there might be in these old country house libraries something to repay a journey. "For," said he, "we English have always this marvellous talent for accumulating rarities in the most unexpected places, ain't it?" And in the course of the evening he was most interesting on the subject of finds made by himself and others. "I shall take the occasion after this sale to look round the district a bit. Perhaps you could inform me of some likely spots, Mr. Davidson." But Mr. Davidson, though he had seen some very tempting locked-up bookcases at Broxton Court, kept his counsel. He did not really like Mr. Homburger. Next day, as he sat in the train, a little ray of light came to illuminate one of yesterday's puzzles. He happened to take out an almanac diary that he had bought for the new year, and it occurred to him to look at the remarkable events for April 25th. There it was, St. Mark, Oliver Cromwell born, 1599. That, coupled with the painted ceiling, seemed to explain a good deal. The figure of old Lady Sadleir became more substantial to his imagination, as of one in whom love for church and king had gradually given place to intense hate of the power that had silenced the one and slaughtered the other. What curious evil service was that which she and a few like her had been wont to celebrate year by year in that remote valley? And how in the world had she managed to elude authority? And again, did not this persistent opening of the books agree oddly with the other traits of her portrait known to him? It would be interesting for anyone who chanced to be near Broxton on the 25th of April to look in at the chapel and see if anything exceptional happened. When he came to think of it, there seemed to be no reason why he should not be that person himself, he, and if possible some congenial friend. He resolved that so it should be. Knowing that he knew really nothing about the printing of prayer books, he realized that he must make it his business to get the best light on the matter without divulging his reasons. I may say at once that his search was entirely fruitless. One writer of the early part of the 19th century, a writer of rather windy and rhapsodical chat about books, professed to have heard of a special anti-Cromwellian issue of the prayer book in the very midst of the Commonwealth period. But he did not claim to have seen a copy, and no one had believed him. Looking into this matter, Mr. Davidson found that the statement was based on letters from a correspondent who had lived near Longbridge, so he was inclined to think that the Broxton prayer books were at the bottom of it, and had excited a momentary interest. Months went on, and St. Mark's Day came near. Nothing interfered with Mr. Davidson's plans of visiting Broxton, or with those of the friend whom he had persuaded to go with him, and to whom alone he had confided the puzzle. The same 9:45 train, which had taken him in January, took them now to Kingsbourne. The same field path led them to Broxton. But today they stopped more than once to pick a cowslip. The distant woods and ploughed uplands were of another colour, and in the copse there was, as Mrs. Porter said, a regular charm of birds. Why, you couldn't hardly collect your mind sometimes with it. She recognized Mr. Davidson at once, and was very ready to do the honours of the chapel. The new visitor, Mr. Witham, was as much struck by the completeness of it as Mr. Davidson had been. "There can't be such another in England," he said. "Books open again, Mrs. Porter?" said Davidson, as they walked up to the chancel. "Dear, yes, I expect so, sir," said Mrs. Porter, as she drew off the cloths. "Well, there," she exclaimed the next moment, "if they ain't shut! That's the first time ever I've found 'em so. But it's not for want of care on my part, I do assure you, gentlemen, if they wasn't, for I felt the cloths the last thing before I shut up last week, when the gentleman had done photographed in the east window, and every one was shut, and where there was ribbons left, I tied 'em. Now I think of it, I don't remember ever to have done that before, and perhaps whoever it is, it just made the difference to 'em. Well, it only shows, don't it? If at first you don't succeed, try again." Meanwhile, the two men had been examining the books, and now Davidson spoke. "I'm sorry to say I'm afraid there's something wrong here, Mrs. Porter. These are not the same books." It would make too long a business to detail all Mrs. Porter's outcries and the questionings that followed. The upshot was this. Early in January, the gentleman had come to see over the chapel, and thought a great deal of it, and said he must come back in the spring weather and take some photographs. And only a week ago he had drove up in his motoring car, and a very heavy box with the slides in it, and she had locked him in because he said something about a long explosion, and she was afraid of some damage happening. And he says no, not explosion, but it appeared the lantern what they take the slides with worked very slow, and so he was in there the best part of an hour, and she come and let him out, and he drove off with his box and all, and gave her his visiting card, and oh dear, to think of such a thing. He must have changed the books and took the old ones away with him in his box. What sort of man was he? Oh dear, he was a small-made gentleman, if you can call him so after the way he behaved, with black hair, that is if it was hair, and gold eyeglasses, if they was gold. Really, one don't know what to believe. Sometimes I doubt he weren't a real Englishman at all, and yet he seemed to know the language and had the name on his visiting card like anybody else might. Just so. Might we see the card? Yes, T.W. Henderson, and an address somewhere near Bristol. Well, Mrs. Porter, it's quite plain this Mr. Henderson, as he calls himself, has walked off with your 8 prayer books and put 8 others about the same size in place of them. Now listen to me. I suppose you must tell your husband about this, but neither you nor he must say one word about it to anyone else. If you'll give me the address of the agent, Mr. Clark, isn't it? I will write to him and tell him exactly what has happened, and that it really is no fault of yours. But you understand we must keep it very quiet. And why? Because this man who has stolen the books will of course try to sell them one at a time, for I may tell you they are worth a good deal of money, and the only way we can bring it home to him is by keeping a sharp lookout and saying nothing. By dint of repeating the same advice in various forms, they succeeded in impressing Mrs. Porter with the real need for silence, and were forced to make a concession only in the case of Mr. Avery, who was expected on a visit shortly. "But you may be safe with father, sir," said Mrs. Porter. "Father ain't a talking man." It was not quite Mr. Davidson's experience of him. Still, there were no neighbours at Broxton, and even Mr. Avery must be aware that gossip with anybody on such a subject would be likely to end in the Porters having to look out for another situation. The last question was whether Mr. Henderson, so-called, had anyone with him. "No, sir, not when he come he hadn't. He was working his own motoring car himself, and what luggage he had, let me see. There was his lantern and this box of slides inside the carriage, which I helped him into the chapel and out of it myself with it. If only I'd knowed. And as he drove away under the big yew tree by the monument, I see the long white bundle laying on the top of the coach, what I didn't notice when he drove up. But he sat in front, sir, and only the boxes inside behind him. And do you really think, sir, as his name weren't Henderson at all? Oh, dear me, what a dreadful thing. Why, I fancy what trouble it might bring to an innocent person that might never have set foot in the place but for that." They left Mrs. Porter in tears. On the way home, there was much discussion as to the best means of keeping watch upon possible sales. What Henderson Homburger, for there could be no real doubt of the identity, had done was obviously to bring down the requisite number of folio prayer books, disused copies from college chapels and the like, bought ostensibly for the sake of the bindings, which were superficially like enough to the old ones, and to substitute them at his leisure for the genuine articles. A week had now passed without any public notice being taken of the theft. He would take a little time himself to find out about the rarity of the books, and would ultimately, no doubt, place them cautiously. Between them, Davidson and Witham were in a position to know a good deal of what was passing in the book world, and they could map out the ground pretty completely. A weak point with them at the moment was that neither of them knew under what other name or names Henderson Homburger carried on business. But there are ways of solving these problems. And yet, all this planning proved unnecessary. 4. We are transported to a London office on this same 25th of April. We find there, within closed doors, late in the day, 2 police inspectors, a commissionaire, and a youthful clerk. The 2 latter, both rather pale and shaky in appearance, are sitting on chairs and being questioned. "How long do you say you've been in this Mr. Poschwitz's employment?" 6 months? And what was his business?" "Attended sales in various parts and brought home parcels of books." "Did he keep a shop anywhere?" "No. Disposed of 'em here and there, and sometimes to private collectors." "Right. Now then, when did he go out last?" "Rather better than a week ago." "Tell you where he was going?" "No. Said he was going to start next day from his private residence, and shouldn't be at the office. That's here, eh? Before 2 days. You was to attend as usual." "Where is his private residence?" "Oh, that's the address. Norwood way. I see. Any family? Not in this country? Now then, what account do you give of what's happened since he came back?" "Came back on the Tuesday, did he? And this is the Saturday. Bring any books?" "1 package. Where is it?" "In the safe." "You got the key?" "No, to be sure. It's open, of course." "How did he seem when he got back?" "Cheerful." "Well, but how do you mean, curious?" "Thought he might be in for an illness. He said that, did he? Odd smell got in his nose. Couldn't get rid of it. Told you to let him know who wanted to see him before you let him in? That wasn't usual with him?" "Much the same all Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Out a good deal. Said he was going to the British Museum. Often went there to make inquiries in the way of his business. Walked up and down a lot in the office when he was in. Anyone call in on those days? Mostly when he was out. Anyone find him in? Oh, Mr. Collinson. Who's Mr. Collinson?" "An old customer." "Know his address?" "All right, give it us afterwards." "Well now, what about this morning? You left Mr. Poschwitz's here at 12 and went home. Anybody see you?" "Commissionaire, you did?" "Remained at home till summoned here." "Very well. Now, Commissionaire, we have your name. Watkins, eh? Very well. Make your statement. Don't go too quick, so as we can get it down." "I was on duty here later than usual, Mr. Portwich having asked me to remain on and ordered his luncheon to be sent in, which came as ordered. I was in the lobby from 11:30 on, and see Mr. Bligh, the clerk, leave at about 12. After that, no one come in at all, except Mr. Portwich's luncheon come at 1 o'clock, and the man left in 5 minutes' time. Towards the afternoon, I became tired of waiting, and I come upstairs to this first floor. The outer door what led to the office stood open, and I come up to the plate glass door here. Mr. Portwich, he was standing behind the table smoking a cigar, and he laid it down on the mantelpiece and felt in his trouser pockets and took out a key and went across to the safe. And I knocked on the glass, thinking to see if he wanted me to come and take away his tray. But he didn't take no notice, being engaged with the safe door. Then he got it open and stooped down and seemed to be lifting up a package off of the floor of the safe. And then, sir, I see what looked to be like a great roll of old shabby white flannel, about 4 to 5 feet high, full forwards out the inside of the safe, right against Mr. Potwitch's shoulder, as he was stooping over. And Mr. Potwitch, he raised himself up, as it were, resting his hands on the package, and gave exclamation. And I can't hardly expect you should take what I says, but as true as I stand here, I see this roll had a kind of a face in the upper end of it, sir. You can't be more surprised than what I was, I can assure you, and I've seen a lot in me time. Yes, I can describe it if you wish it, sir. It was very much the same as this wall here in colour. The wall had an earth-coloured distemper, and it had a bit of a band tied round underneath. And the eyes, well, they was dry-like, and much as if there was 2 big spiders' bodies in the holes. Hair? No, I don't know as there was much hair to be seen. The flannel stuff was over the top of the head. I'm very sure it warn't what it should have been. No, I only see it in a flash, but I took it in like a photograph. Wish I hadn't. Yes, sir, it fell right over onto Mr. Potwitch's shoulder, and this face hid in his neck, yes, sir, about where the injury was. More like a ferret going for a rabbit than anything else. And he rolled over, and of course I tried to get in at the door, but as you know, sir, it were locked on the inside, and all I could do, I rung up everyone, and the surgeon come, and the police, and you gentlemen, and you know as much as what I do. If you won't be requiring me any more today, I'd be glad to be getting off home. It shook me up more than I thought for. Well, said one of the inspectors when they were left alone, and, well, said the other inspector, and after a pause, what's the surgeon's report again? You've got it there. Yes, effect on the blood like the worst kind of snake bite. Death almost instantaneous. I'm glad of that for his sake. He was a nasty sight. No case for detaining this man Watkins, anyway. We know all about him. And what about this safe now? We'd better go over it again. And, by the way, we haven't opened that package he was busy with when he died. Well, handle it careful, said the other. There might be this snake in it, for what you know. Get a light into the corners of the place, too. Well, there's room for a shortish person to stand up in, but what about ventilation? Perhaps, said the other slowly, as he explored the safe with an electric torch. Perhaps they didn't require much of that. My word, it strikes warm coming out of that place, like a vault it is. But here, what's this bank-like of dust all spread out into the room? That must have come there since the door was opened. It would sweep it all away if you moved it. See? Now what do you make of that? Make of it? About as much as I make of anything else in this case. One of London's mysteries this is going to be, by what I can see. And I don't believe a photographer's box full of large-size old-fashioned prayer books is going to take us much further. For that's just what your package is. It was a natural but hasty utterance. The preceding narrative shows that there was in fact plenty of material for constructing a case, and when once Messrs. Davidson and Witham had brought their end to Scotland Yard, the join-up was soon made, and the circle completed. To the relief of Mrs. Porter, the owners of Broxton decided not to replace the books in the chapel. They repose, I believe, in a safe deposit in town. The police have their own methods of keeping certain matters out of the newspapers. Otherwise, it can hardly be supposed that Watkins's evidence about Mr. Poshwitz's death could have failed to furnish a good many headlines of a startling character to the press. The Book by Margaret Irwin. 1. On a foggy night in November, Mr. Corbett, having guessed the murderer by the third chapter of his detective story, arose in disappointment from his bed and went downstairs in search of something more satisfactory to send him to sleep. The fog had crept through the closed and curtained windows of the dining room and hung thick on the air, in a silence that seemed as heavy and breathless as the fog. The atmosphere was more choking than in his room, and very chill, although the remains of a large fire still burned in the grate. The dining room bookcase was the only considerable one in the house, and held a careless, unselected collection to suit all the tastes of the household, together with a few dull and obscure old theological books that had been left over from the sale of a learned uncle's library. Cheap red novels, bought on railway stalls by Mrs. Corbett, who thought a journey the only time to read, were thrust in like pert, undersized intruders among the respectable 19th-century works of culture, chastely bound in dark blue or green, which Mr. Corbett had considered the right thing to buy during his Oxford days. Beside these, there swaggered the children's large, gaily bound storybooks and collections of fairy tales in every colour. From among this neat, new, cloth-bound crowd, there towered here and there a musty sepulchre of learning, brown with the colour of dust rather than leather, with no trace of gilded letters, however faded, on its crumbling back to tell what lay inside. A few of these moribund survivors from the Dean's library were inhospitably fastened with rusty clasps. All remained closed and appeared impenetrable, their blank, forbidding backs uplifted above their frivolous surroundings with the air of scorn that belongs to a private and concealed knowledge. For only the worm of corruption now bored his way through their evil-smelling pages. It was an unusual flight of fancy for Mr. Corbett to imagine that the vaporous and fog-ridden air that seemed to hang more thickly about the bookcase was like a dank and poisonous breath exhaled by one or other of these slowly rotting volumes. Discomfort in this pervasive and impalpable presence came on him more acutely than at any time that day. In an attempt to clear his throat of it, he choked most unpleasantly. He hurriedly chose a Dickens from the second shelf as appropriate to a London fog, and had returned to the foot of the stairs when he decided that his reading tonight should by contrast be of blue Italian skies and white statues, and beautiful rhythmic sentences. He went back for a Walter Pater. He found Marius the Epicurean tipped sideways across the gap left by his withdrawal of the old curiosity shop. It was a very wide gap to have been left by a single volume, for the books on that shelf had been closely wedged together. He put the Dickens back into it, and saw that there was still space for a large book. He said to himself in careful and precise words, "This is nonsense. No one can possibly have gone into the dining room and removed a book while I was crossing the hall. There must have been a gap before in the second shelf." But another part of his mind kept saying in a hurried, tumbled torrent, "There was no gap in the second shelf. There was no gap in the second shelf." He snatched at both the Marius and the old curiosity shop, and went to his room in a haste that was unnecessary and absurd, since even if he believed in ghosts, which he did not, no one had the smallest reason for suspecting any in the modern Kensington house wherein he and his family had lived for the last 15 years. Reading was the best thing to calm the nerves, and Dickens was a pleasant, wholesome, and robust author. Tonight, however, Dickens struck him in a different light. Beneath the author's sentimental pity for the weak and helpless, he could discern a revolting pleasure in cruelty and suffering, while the grotesque figures of the people in Cruikshank's illustrations revealed too clearly the hideous distortions of their souls. What had seemed humorous now appeared diabolic, and in disgust at these two old favourites he turned to Walter Pater for the repose and dignity of a classic spirit. But presently he wondered if this spirit were not in itself of a marble quality, frigid and lifeless, contrary to the purpose of nature. "I have often thought," he said to himself, that there is something evil in the austere worship of beauty for its own sake. He had never thought so before, but he liked to think that this impulse of fancy was the result of mature consideration, and with this satisfaction he composed himself for sleep. He woke 2 or 3 times in the night, an unusual occurrence, but he was glad of it, for each time he had been dreaming horribly of these blameless Victorian works. Sprightly devils in whiskers and peg-top trousers tortured a lovely maiden and leered in delight at her anguish. The gods and heroes of classic fable acted deeds whose naked crime and shame Mr. Corbett had never appreciated in Latin and Greek unscenes. When he had woken in a cold sweat from the spectacle of the ravished Philomel's torn and bleeding tongue, he decided there was nothing for it but to go down and get another book that would turn his thoughts in some more pleasant direction. But his increasing reluctance to do this found 100 excuses. The recollection of the gap in the shelf now occurred to him with a sense of unnatural importance. In the troubled dozes that followed, this gap between 2 books seemed the most hideous deformity, like a gap between the front teeth of some grinning monster. But in the clear daylight of the morning, Mr. Corbett came down to the pleasant dining room, its sunny windows and smell of coffee and toast, and ate an undiminished breakfast with a mind chiefly occupied in self-congratulation that the wind had blown the fog away in time for this Saturday game of golf. Whistling happily, he was pouring out his final cup of coffee, when his hand remained arrested in the act as his glance, roving across to the bookcase, noticed that there was now no gap at all in the second shelf. He asked who had been at the bookcase already, but neither of the girls had, nor Dickie, and Mrs. Corbett was not yet down. The maid never touched the books. They wanted to know what book he missed in it, which made him look foolish, as he could not say. The things that disturb us at midnight are negligible at 9 a.m. "I thought there was a gap in the second shelf," he said, "but it doesn't matter." "There never is a gap in the second shelf," said little Jean brightly. "You can take out lots of books from it, and when you go back the gap's always filled up. Haven't you noticed that? I have." Nora, the middle one in age, said Jean was always being silly. She had been found crying over the funny pictures in The Rose and the Ring, because she said all the people in them had such wicked faces, and the picture of a black cat had upset her because she thought it was a witch. Mr. Corbett did not like to think of such fancies for his Jeanie. She retaliated briskly by saying Dickie was just as bad, and he was a big boy. He had kicked a book across the room and said, "Filthy stuff," just like that. Jean was a good mimic. Her tone expressed a venom of disgust, and she made the gesture of dropping a book as though the very touch of it were loathsome. Dickie, who had been making violent signs at her, now told her she was a beastly little sneak, and he would never again take her for rides on the step of his bicycle. Mr. Corbett was disturbed. Unpleasant housemaids and bad school friends passed through his head as he gravely asked his son how he had got hold of this book. "Took it out of that bookcase, of course," said Dickie furiously. It turned out to be the Boy's Gulliver's Travels that Granny had given him, and Dickie had at last to explain his rage with the devil who wrote it to show that men were worse than beasts and the human race a washout. A boy who never had good school reports had no right to be so morbidly sensitive as to penetrate to the underlying cynicism of Swift's delightful fable, and that, moreover, in the bright and carefully expurgated edition they bring out nowadays. Mr. Corbett could not say he had ever noticed the cynicism himself, though he knew from the critical books it must be there, and with some annoyance he advised his son to take out a nice, bright, modern boy's adventure story that could not depress anybody. It appeared, however, that Dickie was off reading just now, and the girls echoed this. Mr. Corbett soon found that he too was off reading. Every new book seemed to him weak, tasteless, and insipid, while his old and familiar books were depressing, or even, in some obscure way, disgusting. Authors must all be filthy-minded. They probably wrote what they dared not express in their lives. Stevenson had said that literature was a morbid secretion. He read Stevenson again to discover his peculiar morbidity, and detected in his essays a self-pity masquerading as courage, and in Treasure Island an invalid's sickly attraction to brutality. This gave him a zest to find out what he disliked so much, and his taste for reading revived as he explored with relish the hidden infirmities of minds that had been valued by fools as great and noble. He saw Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte as two unpleasant examples of spinsterhood, the one as a prying, subacid busybody in everyone else's flirtations, the other as a raving, craving maenad seeking self-immolation on the altar of her frustrated passions. He compared Wordsworth's love of nature to the monstrous egoism of an ancient bellwether, isolated from the flock. These powers of penetration astonished him. With a mind so acute and original, he should have achieved greatness, yet he was a mere solicitor, and not prosperous at that. If he had but the money, he might do something with those ivory shares, but it would be a pure gamble, and he had no luck. His natural envy of his wealthier acquaintance now mingled with a contempt for their stupidity that approached loathing. The digestion of his lunch in the city was ruined by meeting sentimental yet successful dotards whom he had once regarded as pleasant fellows. The very sight of them spoiled his game of golf, so that he came to prefer reading alone in the dining room, even on sunny afternoons. He discovered also, and with a slight shock, that Mrs. Corbett had always bored him. Dickie he began actively to dislike as an impudent blockhead, and the two girls were as insipidly alike as white mice. It was a relief when he abolished their tiresome habit of coming in to say good night. In the now unbroken silence and seclusion of the dining room, he read with feverish haste, as though he were seeking for some clue to knowledge, some secret key to existence which would quicken and inflame it, transform it from its present dull torpor to a life worthy of him and his powers. He even explored the few decaying remains of his uncle's theological library. Bored and baffled, he yet persisted, and had the occasional relief of an ugly woodcut of Adam and Eve, with figures like bolsters and hair like dahlias, or a map of the cosmos with Hellmouth in the corner, belching forth demons. One of these books had diagrams and symbols in the margin, which he took to be mathematical formulae of a kind he did not know. He presently discovered that they were drawn, not printed, and that the book was in manuscript, in a very neat, crabbed black writing that resembled black-letter printing. It was, moreover, in Latin, a fact that gave Mr. Corbett a shock of unreasoning disappointment. For while examining the signs in the margin, he had been filled with an extraordinary exultation, as though he knew himself to be on the edge of a discovery that should alter his whole life. But he had forgotten his Latin. With a secret and guilty air which would have looked absurd to anyone who knew his harmless purpose, he stole to the schoolroom for Dickie's Latin dictionary and grammar, and hurried back to the dining room, where he tried to discover what the book was about with an anxious industry that surprised himself. There was no name to it, nor of the author. Several blank pages had been left at the end, and the writing ended at the bottom of a page, with no flourish or subscription, as though the book had been left unfinished. From what sentences he could translate, it seemed to be a work on theology rather than mathematics. There were constant references to the Master, to his wishes and injunctions, which appeared to be of a complicated kind. Mr. Corbett began by skipping these as mere accounts of ceremonial, but a word caught his eye as one unlikely to occur in such an account. He read this passage attentively, looking up each word in the dictionary, and could hardly believe the result of his translation. Clearly, he decided, this book must be by some early missionary, and the passage I've just read the account of some horrible rite practiced by a savage tribe of devil-worshippers. Though he called it horrible, he reflected on it, committing each detail to memory. He then amused himself by copying the signs in the margin near it and trying to discover their significance. But a sensation of sickly cold came over him. His head swam, and he could hardly see the figures before his eyes. He suspected a sudden attack of influenza, and went to ask his wife for medicine. They were all in the drawing-room, Mrs. Corbett helping Nora and Jean with a new game, Dickie playing the pianola, and Mike, the Irish terrier, who had lately deserted his accustomed place on the dining-room hearthrug, stretched by the fire. Mr. Corbett had an instant's impression of this peaceful and cheerful scene, before his family turned towards him and asked in scared tones what was the matter. He thought how like sheep they looked and sounded. Nothing in his appearance in the mirror struck him as odd. It was their gaping faces that were unfamiliar. He then noticed the extraordinary behavior of Mike, who had sprung from the hearthrug and was crouched in the farthest corner, uttering no sound, but with his eyes distended and foam round his bared teeth. Under Mr. Corbett's glance he slunk towards the door, whimpering in a faint and abject manner. And then, as his master called him, he snarled horribly, and the hair bristled on the scruff of his neck. Dickie let him out, and they heard him scuffling at a frantic rate down the stairs to the kitchen, and then, again and again, a long-drawn howl. "What can be the matter with Mike?" asked Mrs. Corbett. Her question broke a silence that seemed to have lasted a long time. Jean began to cry. Mr. Corbett said irritably that he did not know what was the matter with any of them. Then Nora asked, "What is that red mark on your face?" He looked again in the glass and could see nothing. "It's quite clear from here," said Dickie. "I can see the lines in the fingerprint." "Yes, that's what it is," said Mrs. Corbett in her brisk staccato voice. "The print of a finger on your forehead. Have you been writing in red ink?" Mr. Corbett precipitately left the room for his own, where he sent down a message that he was suffering from headache and would have his dinner in bed. He wanted no one fussing round him. By next morning he was amazed at his fancies of influenza, for he had never felt so well in his life. No one commented on his looks at breakfast, so he concluded that the mark had disappeared. The old Latin book he had been translating on the previous night had been moved from the writing bureau, although Dickie's grammar and dictionary were still there. The second shelf was, as always in the daytime, closely packed. The book had, he remembered, been in the second shelf, but this time he did not ask who had put it back. 2. That day he had an unexpected stroke of luck in a new client of the name of Crabbe, who entrusted him with large sums of money. Nor was he irritated by the sight of his more prosperous acquaintance, but with difficulty refrained from grinning in their faces, so confident was he that his remarkable ability must soon place him higher than any of them. At dinner he chaffed his family with what he felt to be the gaiety of a schoolboy, but on them it had a contrary effect, for they stared either at him in stupid astonishment or at their plates, depressed and nervous. Did they think him drunk, he wondered, and a fury came on him at their low and bestial suspicions and heavy dullness of mind. Why, he was younger than any of them. But in spite of this new alertness, he could not attend to the letters he should have written that evening, and drifted to the bookcase for a little light distraction, but found that for the first time there was nothing he wished to read. He pulled out a book from above his head at random, and saw that it was the old Latin book in manuscript. As he turned over its stiff and yellow pages, he noticed with pleasure the smell of corruption that had first repelled him in these decaying volumes, a smell, he now thought, of ancient and secret knowledge. This idea of secrecy seemed to affect him personally, for on hearing a step in the hall he hastily closed the book and put it back in its place. He went to the schoolroom, where Dickie was doing his homework, and told him he required his Latin grammar and dictionary again for an old law report. To his annoyance, he stammered and put his words awkwardly. He thought that the boy looked oddly at him, and he cursed him in his heart for a suspicious young devil, though of what he should be suspicious he could not say. Nevertheless, when back in the dining room, he listened at the door and then softly turned the lock before he opened the books on the writing bureau. The script and Latin seemed much clearer than on the previous evening, and he was able to read at random a passage relating to the trial of a German midwife in 1620 for the murder and dissection of 783 children. Even allowing for the opportunities afforded by her profession, the number appeared excessive, nor could he discover any motive for the slaughter. He decided to translate the book from the beginning. It appeared to be an account of some secret society, whose activities and ritual were of a nature so obscure, and were not so vile and terrible, that Mr. Corbett would not at first believe that this could be a record of any human mind, although his deep interest in it should have convinced him that from his humanity at least it was not altogether alien. He read until far later than his usual hour for bed, and when at last he rose, it was with the book in his hands. To defer his parting with it, he stood turning over the pages until he reached the end of the writing, and was struck by a new peculiarity. The ink was much fresher and of a far poorer quality than the thick, rusted ink in the bulk of the book. On close inspection, he would have said that it was of modern manufacture, and written quite recently, were it not for the fact that it was in the same crabbed, late 17th century handwriting. This, however, did not explain the perplexity, even dismay and fear he now felt, as he stared at the last sentence. It ran, "Contine te in perenibus studis," and he had at once recognized it as a Ciceronian tag that had been dinned into him at school. He could not understand how he had failed to notice it yesterday. Then he remembered that the book had ended at the bottom of a page, but now the last two sentences were written at the very top of a page. However long he looked at them, he could come to no other conclusion than that they had been added since the previous evening. He now read the sentence before the last, "Re imperfecta mortuus sum," and translated the whole as, "I died with my purpose unachieved. Continue thou the never-ending studies." With his eyes still fixed upon it, Mr. Corbett replaced the book on the writing bureau and stepped back from it to the door, his hand outstretched behind him, groping and then tugging at the door handle. As the door failed to open, his breath came in a faint, hardly articulate scream. Then he remembered that he had himself locked it, and he fumbled with the key in frantic, ineffectual movements until at last he opened it and banged it after him as he plunged backwards into the hall. For a moment, he stood there looking at the door handle. Then, with a stealthy, sneaking movement, his hand crept out towards it, touched it, began to turn it, when suddenly he pulled his hand away and went up to his bedroom, 3 steps at a time. There he behaved in a manner only comparable with the way he had lost his head after losing his innocence when a schoolboy of 16. He hid his face in the pillow, he cried, he raved in meaningless words, repeating, "Never, never, never. I will never do it again. Help me never do it again." With the words, "Help me," he noticed what he was saying. They reminded him of other words, and he began to pray aloud. But the words sounded jumbled. They persisted in coming into his head in a reverse order, so that he found he was saying his prayers backwards, and at this final absurdity he suddenly began to laugh very loud. He sat up on the bed, delighted at this return to sanity, common sense and humour, when the door leading into Mrs. Corbett's room opened, and he saw his wife staring at him with a strange, grey, drawn face that made her seem like the terror-stricken ghost of her usually smug and placid self. "It's not burglars," he said irritably. "I've come to bed late, that is all, and must have waked you." "Henry," said Mrs. Corbett, and he noticed that she had not heard him. "Henry, didn't you hear it?" "What?" "That laugh." He was silent, an instinctive caution warning him to wait until she spoke again. And this she did, imploring him with her eyes to reassure her. It was not a human laugh. It was like the laugh of a devil. He checked his violent inclination to laugh again. It was wiser not to let her know that it was only his laughter she had heard. He told her to stop being fanciful, and Mrs. Corbett, gradually recovering her docility, returned to obey an impossible command, since she could not stop being what she had never been. The next morning, Mr. Corbett rose before any of the servants and crept down to the dining room. As before, the dictionary and grammar alone remained on the writing bureau. The book was back on the second shelf. He opened it at the end. 2 more lines had been added, carrying the writing down to the middle of the page. They ran, "Ex auro canceris, indentem elephantis," which he translated as, "Out of the money of the crab, into the tooth of the elephant." From this time on, his acquaintance in the city noticed a change in the mediocre, rather flabby and unenterprising old Corbett. His recent sour depression dropped from him. He seemed to have grown 20 years younger, strong, brisk, and cheerful, and with a self-confidence in business that struck them as lunacy. They waited with a not unpleasant excitement for the inevitable crash, but his every speculation, however wild and harebrained, turned out successful. He no longer avoided them, but went out of his way to display his consciousness of luck, daring, and vigor, and to chaff them in a manner that began to make him actively disliked. This he welcomed with delight, as a sign of others' envy and his superiority. He never stayed in town for dinners or theatres, for he was always now in a hurry to get home, where, as soon as he was sure of being undisturbed, he would take down the manuscript book from the second shelf of the dining room and turn to the last pages. Every morning he found that a few words had been added since the evening before, and always they formed, as he considered, injunctions to himself. These were at first only with regard to his money transactions, giving assurance to his boldest fancies, and since the brilliant and unforeseen success that had attended his gamble with Mr. Crabbe's money in African ivory, he followed all such advice unhesitatingly. But presently, interspersed with these commands, were others of a meaningless, childish yet revolting character, such as might be invented by a decadent imbecile, or, it must be admitted, by the idle fancies of any ordinary man who permits his imagination to wander unbridled. Mr. Corbett was startled to recognize 1 or 2 such fancies of his own, which had occurred to him during his frequent boredom in church, and which he had not thought any other mind could conceive. He at first paid no attention to these directions, but found that his new speculations declined so rapidly that he became terrified, not merely for his fortune, but for his reputation and even safety, since the money of various of his clients was involved. It was made clear to him that he must follow the commands in the book altogether or not at all, and he began to carry out their puerile and grotesque blasphemies with a contemptuous amusement, which, however, gradually changed to a sense of their monstrous significance. They became more capricious and difficult of execution, but he now never hesitated to obey blindly, urged by a fear that he could not understand, but knew only that it was not of mere financial failure. By now, he understood the effect of this book on the others near it, and the reason that had impelled its mysterious agent to move the books into the second shelf so that all in turn should come under the influence of that ancient and secret knowledge. In respect to it, he encouraged the children, with jeers at their stupidity, to read more, but he could not observe that they ever now took a book from the dining-room bookcase. He himself no longer needed to read, but went to bed early and slept sound. The things that all his life he had longed to do when he should have enough money now seemed to him insipid. His most exciting pleasure was the smell and touch of these mouldering pages, as he turned them to find the last message inscribed to him. One evening it was in 2 words only, Canum Hocide. He laughed at this simple and pleasant request to kill the dog, for he bore Mike a grudge for his change from devotion to slinking aversion. Moreover, it could not have come more opportunely, since in turning out an old desk he had just discovered some packets of rat poison bought years ago and forgotten. No one therefore knew of its existence, and it would be easy to poison Mike without any further suspicion than that of a neighbour's carelessness. He whistled light-heartedly as he ran upstairs to rummage for the packets, and returned to empty one in the dog's dish of water in the hall. That night the household was awakened by terrified screams proceeding from the stairs. Mr. Corbett was the first to hasten there, prompted by the instinctive caution that was always with him these days. He saw Jean, in her nightdress, scrambling up onto the landing on her hands and knees, clutching at anything that afforded support and screaming in a choking, tearless, unnatural manner. He carried her to the room she shared with Nora, where they were quickly followed by Mrs. Corbett. Nothing coherent could be got from Jean. Nora said that she must have been having her old dream again. When her father demanded what this was, she said that Jean sometimes woke in the night, crying, because she had dreamed of a hand passing backwards and forwards over the dining-room bookcase until it found a certain book and took it out of the shelf. At this point, she was always so frightened that she woke up. On hearing this, Jean broke into fresh screams, and Mrs. Corbett would have no more explanations. Mr. Corbett went out to the stairs to find what had brought the child there from her bed. On looking down into the lighted hall, he saw Mike's dish overturned. He went down to examine it, and saw that the water he had poisoned must have been upset and absorbed by the rough doormat, which was quite wet. He went back to the little girl's room, told his wife that she was tired and must go to bed, and he would take his turn at comforting Jean. She was now much quieter. He took her on his knee, for at first she shrank from him. Mr. Corbett remembered with an angry sense of injury that she never now sat on his knee, and would have liked to pay her out for it by mocking and frightening her. But he had to coax her into telling him what he wanted, and with this object he soothed her, calling her by pet names that he thought he had forgotten, telling her that nothing could hurt her now he was with her. At first his cleverness amused him. He chuckled softly when Jean buried her head in his dressing-gown, but presently an uncomfortable sensation came over him. He gripped at Jean as though for her protection, while he was so smoothly assuring her of his. With difficulty, he listened to what he had at last induced her to tell him. She and Nora had kept Mike with them all the evening and taken him to sleep in their room for a treat. He had lain at the foot of Jean's bed, and they had all gone to sleep. Then Jean began her old dream of the hand moving over the books in the dining-room bookcase. But instead of taking out a book, it came across the dining room and out onto the stairs. It came up over the banisters and to the door of their room, and turned their door handle very softly, and opened it. At this point she jumped up wide awake and turned on the light, calling to Nora. The door, which had been shut when they went to sleep, was wide open, and Mike was gone. She told Nora that she was sure something dreadful would happen to him if she did not go and bring him back, and ran down into the hall, where she saw him just about to drink from his dish. She called to him, and he looked up, but did not come, so she ran to him and began to pull him along with her, when her nightdress was clutched from behind, and then she felt a hand seize her arm. She fell down and then clambered upstairs as fast as she could, screaming all the way. It was now clear to Mr. Corbett that Mike's dish must have been upset in the scuffle. She was again crying, but this time he felt himself unable to comfort her. He retired to his room, where he walked up and down in an agitation he could not understand, for he found his thoughts perpetually arguing on a point that had never troubled him before. "I am not a bad man," he kept saying to himself. "I've never done anything actually wrong. My clients are none the worse for my speculations, only the better. Nor have I spent my new wealth on gross and sensual pleasures. These now have even no attraction for me." Presently he added, "It is not wrong to try and kill a dog, an ill-tempered brute. It turned against me. It might have bitten Jeanie." He noticed that he had thought of her as Jeanie, which he had not done for some time. It must have been because he had called her that tonight. He must forbid her ever to leave her room at night. He could not have her meddling. It would be safer for him if she were not there at all. Again that sick and cold sensation of fear swept over him. He seized the bedpost as though he were falling, and held on to it for some minutes. "I was thinking of a boarding school," he told himself, and then, "I must go down and find out. He would not think what it was he must find out. He opened his door and listened. The house was quiet. He crept onto the landing and along to Nora's and Jean's door, where again he stood listening. There was no sound, and at that he was again overcome with unreasonable terror. He imagined Jean lying very still in her bed, too still. He hastened away from the door, shuffling in his bedroom slippers along the passage and down the stairs. A bright fire still burned in the dining-room grate. A glance at the clock told him it was not yet 12. He stared at the bookcase. In the second shelf was a gap which had not been there when he had left. On the writing bureau lay a large, open book. He knew that he must cross the room and see what was written in it. Then, as before, words that he did not intend came sobbing and crying to his lips, muttering, No, not that. Never, never, never." But he crossed the room and looked down at the book. As last time, the message was in only 2 words. Infantum Hercide. He slipped and fell forward against the bureau. His hands clutched at the book, lifted it as he recovered himself, and with his finger he traced out the words that had been written. The smell of corruption crept into his nostrils. He told himself that he was not a snivelling dotard, but a man stronger and wiser than his fellows, superior to the common emotions of humanity, who held in his hands the sources of ancient and secret power. He had known what the message would be. It was, after all, the only safe and logical thing to do. Jean had acquired dangerous knowledge. She was a spy, an antagonist. That she was so unconsciously, that she was 8 years old, his youngest and favorite child, were sentimental appeals that could make no difference to a man of sane reasoning power such as his own. Jean had sided with Mike against him. "All that are not with me are against me," he repeated softly. He would kill both dog and child with the white powder that no one knew to be in his possession. It would be quite safe. He laid down the book and went to the door. What he had to do he would do quickly, for again that sensation of deadly cold was sweeping over him. He wished he had not to do it tonight. Last night it would have been easier, but tonight she had sat on his knee and made him afraid. He imagined her lying very still in her bed, too still. But it would be she who would lie there, not he, so why should he be afraid? He was protected by ancient and secret powers. He held on to the door-handle, but his fingers seemed to have grown numb, for he could not turn it. He clung to it, crouched and shivering, bending over it until he knelt on the ground, his head beneath the handle which he still clutched with upraised hands. Suddenly, the hands were loosened and flung outwards with the frantic gesture of a man falling from a great height, and he stumbled to his feet. He seized the book and threw it on the fire. A violent sensation of choking overcame him. He felt he was being strangled. As in a nightmare, he tried again and again to shriek aloud, but his breath would make no sound. His breath would not come at all. He fell backwards heavily, down on the floor, where he lay very still. In the morning, the maid who came to open the dining-room windows found her master dead. The sensation caused by this was scarcely so great in the city as that given by the simultaneous collapse of all Mr. Corbett's recent speculations. It was instantly assumed that he must have had previous knowledge of this and so committed suicide. The stumbling block of this theory was that the medical report defined the cause of Mr. Corbett's death as strangulation of the windpipe by the pressure of a hand which had left the marks of its fingers on his throat. The Meerschaum Pipe by L.A. Lewis. November 17th. Never having tried keeping a diary before, it will be amusing to see whether I have enough mental energy to go on with it. At all events, my newfound leisure will not give me the excuse of being too busy. The only question about it is, shall I find anything worth recording in this quiet country existence? Well, it pleases me to begin with such a trifle as my own enjoyment in this property I have bought. And, after all, I am writing for myself and not for others. My ability to retire and settle down at the early age of 40 is a cause of gratitude to the gods of chance, who gave me such rapid commercial success in the slump years, when so many others were feeling the pinch. I just happened to strike the right propositions all the time, and now I can play the squire in my new domain and look forward to the idyllic life which next summer will bring, fishing and pottering about these beautiful, unspoilt backwaters. Not that I despise the country and its pursuits in winter, being country-bred, particularly in this fine old house. I shall find all the entertainment I need for the long evenings, sorting through the books and all the lumber with which it is stocked. And by next winter I hope to have made friends who will come round for billiards or cards. Perhaps I may marry again, for Heronay should possess a hostess, but I fear I could never bring to another union the zeal of my first romantic attachment, so quickly ended in one of the London air raids. I feel myself lucky to have got to Heronay at such a bargain price, and suppose it would have cost me a good few thousands more, but for the bad name it derives from its former occupant. After standing empty, however, for so many years, the dilapidation was great, and I could see how the agents jumped at my offer. It is rather strange how a house can continue to bear an ill repute from the misdemeanors of a tenant, even years after his or her death, though no doubt this place holds very gruesome associations for many of the local residents. One can excuse Harper his crimes on the ground of his undeniable lunacy, but his reign of terror, conducted from here, must have been a ghastly period for the neighborhood, especially in view of the shocking mutilations he always practiced. Still, he died long ago in Broadmoor, and it is thought that the ground was cleared of all his victims. I've had the exterior entirely refaced, and I think Heronay may now claim to be purged of his influence. Well, I seem to be rambling on. A good start for the diary, anyway, if I can keep it up. Now I will close for today and spend the rest of the evening looking over my new possessions. November 18th. A bright day for the time of year, crisp and frosty. Had a call from the vicar, who asked, among other things, if I proposed to join the local hunt. Told him that I was no horseman, but hoped to do a bit of shooting when more completely settled. He then touched on the poor maniac, my predecessor, and I asked him if he thought the dreadful record of the place would affect my welcome in the village. He replied that he was sure the people in the other big houses would soon forget Harper when they realized the hospitality of the new owner and saw how the whole estate had been cleansed of its former unkempt appearance. The villagers, though, would take longer to accept me to their confidence, and I must not be surprised if tradesmen refused to deliver goods after dark, as the grounds of Heronay were popularly supposed to be haunted. He made his exit after inviting me to dinner next week, when he promised I should meet some of my new neighbours at the vicarage. I shall welcome the change from solitude, although my evenings here will not be dull, while I have so many of Harper's belongings to look through. He appears to have had no next of kin, which accounts for all the furniture being sold with the house. Before his dementia overtook him, he must have been a man of refinement. His library is a book-lover's paradise, and his personal knickknacks and ornaments mostly of quite intrinsic value. While rummaging in the drawers of the study desk last night, I found a remarkably fine Meerschaum pipe, which he must have smoked for many years, to judge by the degree of coloration of the bowl. It has an amber mouthpiece set in gold, and is in fact quite an ornament. I intend to clean it up and give it a place of honor on the mantel-shelf. My man can polish it when he starts on the china. As an ex-army batman, polishing is a hobby with him. Incidentally, I must consider engaging a staff of servants now that I am about to meet new people. Jobson can manage quite well in a flat, as he has done for so long during my city career, but we shall need more than occasional daily help if we are to entertain as I hope to be entertained. That's all for today. I shall consult the local registry, if any, in the morning. November 19th. An irritating setback today. Called on Miss Sims, the postmistress, who acts as domestic registrar, and she promised to send round some applicants for my household jobs. Left her thinking the matter as good as settled, and stayed at home till lunchtime, but nobody called. Now she has rung up to say that she can find no one suitable at the moment. On reflection, I thought her a bit evasive during the interview, and am inclined to suspect the cause is all this superstitious rubbish the vicar mentioned. Suppose I shall have to get servants from elsewhere, but it is very ridiculous. My alterations have given the place quite a modern appearance, and there is nothing sinister about the grounds at night. Evidently, the local proletariat keep dwelling on the secret burials that used to take place, and imagination has done the rest. Spent the earlier part of the evening thinking things over and planning for the future. I must seriously consider taking another wife. She might solve the servant problem more readily, and a hostess is really essential for entertaining married guests. But I don't fancy the notion a bit. Mary's memory is still too fresh even after all these years. Perhaps a lady housekeeper. Jobson has made a splendid job of the Meerschaum, which looks, as I said before, definitely ornamental. I have a great fancy for this class of pipe myself, though I have never achieved such superb colour in any of my own. I am, in fact, tempted to sterilize the stem of this one and see how it tastes. It should prove a ripe smoke. It has never occurred to me before to smoke another man's pipe, much less that of a homicidal maniac. But I think washing the mouthpiece with Lysol and scouring the bowl stem with a hot wire should destroy any possible germs. November 20th. I carried out my intention before retiring last night, and so enjoyed my smoke that I felt disinclined for writing up any more of this diary. With a load of my favourite tobacco, and a good fire in the study, the time passed like lightning. Really speaking, I think I must have dozed, though the meerschaum was still burning well when I saw by the clock that it was well past my usual bedtime. Today I feel rather unrested, though I was sleeping soundly when Jobson called me. Most likely I have spent too much time indoors lately, browsing among the relics of Harper's tenancy. When I am getting daily fresh air and exercise, I never dream. But I am under the impression that my sleep was disturbed last night, though I cannot recall any details. I shall take a walk round the grounds now and blow the cobwebs away before lunch. Later. My morning walk very beneficial and brightened by parading my new acquisition. Saw the vicar and Dr. Corbett, the local GP, passing my drive gates, and they complimented me on the colour of it. As they made no reference to Harper, I took it they did not recognize it as his, and I did not choose to enlighten them. My ramble took me to a strip of waste ground enclosed by a shrubbery, and a walk where, I am told, 2 of Harper's victims were buried. Their trunks, at least. It seemed an ideal spot for a murder, and I could almost enter into his distorted point of view, at least as far as the spice of secrecy was concerned. There must be a grim fascination in committing a crime that rouses the countryside and then watching the police go off on false scents. Harper went about his butchery for months without attracting the least suspicion. Evidently he can have shown no outward symptom of insanity between the attacks, and must have exercised amazing caution in executing his horrible tasks. Yet his dementia was of an extreme kind, as was shown by the distorted artistry of his mutilations. Employed the afternoon and evening in a fruitless journey to the county town, 20 miles away, in search of domestics. Interviewed several candidates who happened to be at the registry office, but as soon as I mentioned my address, they made various excuses not to accept service with me. The popular aversion to Heronay is very widespread, it seems, and it looks as if I shall have to engage my staff in London. Most annoying. Found some newspaper cuttings in the course of my evening's exploring among Harper's belongings. They all related to his criminal career, and I could picture him gloating over the horror which his monstrous recreation was instilling in the public mind. Having been abroad at the time, I was not well up in the history of this butcher, and so took the trouble to read the cuttings through. Apparently, he was actuated by no personal motives, but from a general lust to kill, and his victims were invariably women. The most revolting feature of the murders was his habit of severing the head and limbs with a sharp hatchet and leaving them on the scene for identification, while carrying away the trunk for addition to a sort of museum which is supposed to have been kept in some room of the house. The subsequent interring seems only to have been effected when decomposition rendered it necessary, as the police deduced from the remains. November 21st. Another disturbed night, judging by the morning's lassitude, though again I have no clear recollection of my dreams beyond the feeling that they were of a distressing and even frightening nature. Also, I am convinced that I did, for me, quite an unprecedented thing. I noticed earth stains on my feet when getting into my bath, and Jobson found more of them on the bed linen, from which it is clear that I must have walked in my sleep. I've always regarded this as a sign of mental unbalance, so told Jobson I had gone down to the garden, fancying I heard an intruder. He must have wondered why I did not wear my slippers, but is too well trained to offer such criticism. I have never had a day's illness in my life, and I do not like this symptom of nerve trouble, especially as I spent most of yesterday out of doors. I shall spend today on the links and get my lunch at the clubhouse. Later. A splendid game of golf with a member to whom the secretary introduced me, and another round by myself in the afternoon. I should sleep well tonight. Meanwhile, a sensation has arisen in the village by the discovery of a dead body in Arningham Woods. It appears to be a case of murder, the victim being a young girl from a gypsy encampment nearby. The postman told me that her throat had been cut, and that one of the hands, severed at the wrist, was missing. The last I take to be a piece of village gossip originating in Harper's dismembering proclivities. I understand the affair is regarded as probably a crime of jealousy, and that the police are looking for a young basket maker who left the camp this morning. Enough diary for today. Just half an hour's smoking. I shall not want any rocking. November 22nd. Once more a shockingly restless night, this time caused by definite nightmares. Though I fell asleep at once and do not remember awakening until Jobson brought my tea, I feel as if I had been on the tiles. Most of the time I seemed to be pacing endless corridors and clambering up and down stairs, burdened by some weighty object which I was trying to conceal. What it was, I cannot remember, except that it seemed both precious and repulsive simultaneously, and that I was in a panic in case anyone find me with it. I examined my feet on rising for any traces of sleepwalking, but could find no such evidence. One thing, however, puzzled me, namely that I appeared to be wearing different pyjamas from those in which I went to bed. Still, most of my sleeping suits resemble each other, being all black silk and varying only in the braiding, so I may have been mistaken. Somnambulism apart, though, if these exhausting dreams continue, I must ask Corbett for a tonic. It will be a good opportunity to mention the matter if I can persuade him to a round of golf this afternoon. Later. I was wrong, it would seem, to start this diary wondering if I should find enough to write about in so rural a spot. The murder of the gypsy girl has now been followed by the mysterious disappearance of a cottager's daughter. By a coincidence, she is one of the prospective maids I interviewed 2 days ago, and although in service in the county town, was spending the weekend here with her family. Apparently she went out for a solitary walk late last evening, and she has not been seen since, nor has she returned to her employer's residence. The discovery of bloodstains in a little-used lane near the village has, of course, given rise to a crop of ugly rumors, but as none of the girl's clothing or belongings has come to light, I see no reason to connect the two facts. Quite probably a case of elopement. I was about to close my diary for the day when Jobson entered my study in a great state of agitation. He had been taking a moonlight walk in the grounds near one of the boundary walls when he noticed some unusual object in a tussock of grass. Stooping to examine it, he saw to his horror that it was a human hand. As he finished describing the finding of it, he produced the horrible thing from a roll of newspaper and laid it on my desk. When, overcoming my natural revulsion, I inspected it under a powerful reading lamp. Though no student of anatomy, I judged it to be the hand of a woman, partly, I dare say, on account of the cheap and gaudy rings which adorned 2 of the fingers. These baubles seemed in a vague way familiar, and I supposed that I had seen their wearer at some time in the village. Naturally, I rang up the police without loss of time, and have spent the last hour talking with the inspector, a very capable man who, as a young member of the force, was instrumental in Harper's arrest. He not only confirmed the rumor of the gypsy's hand having been cut off, but positively identified it with Jobson's grim find. He thinks that the basket maker, an unsuccessful suitor, must have taken the hand as a keepsake, and then, fearing to keep so terrible a reminder, have thrown it over my wall in his flight. This theory gives them a clue to the direction in which he was travelling, and the inspector spoke hopefully of an early arrest. November 26th. The events of the past few days have occupied my mind to the exclusion of all other matters. My diary has been neglected, and I must recapitulate. So far from rustic uneventfulness, I seem to have landed myself in the middle of a grand guignol play. A fresh series of crimes, identical with those of my perverted predecessor, has broken out in the neighborhood, and the surrounding country is teeming with police, pressmen, and morbid sightseers. By having the gates locked, I have been able to keep most of them off this property, but I caught 2 reporters astride the wall near Harper's Cemetery yesterday, and had Jobson turn them away. The village is in a state of siege, as no woman will venture out after dark, and even by daylight they go in 2s and 3s. A rumor that Harper had not died at Broadmoor but had escaped rapidly gained ground, and I found myself wondering if this were the case. The police, however, assure me that he died years ago, and that so far from any such escape being hushed up, a warning would be broadcast to all districts. Hard upon the heels of Jobson's discovery of the hand came news of a second mutilation during the ensuing night. The head, arms, and legs of Dr. Corbett's cook were found lying on a tombstone in the churchyard. The torso was missing. The night after, another woman's head and limbs were left neatly piled by the roadside, not far from the assembly rooms. They must have been placed there in the early morning hours, as a local dance held there was not over till well after midnight. It is very disturbing to have this dangerous lunatic on one's doorstep, apart from the noisy crowd of sightseers who came to pry around and even picnic on the sites of his crimes. To add to all this discord, and perhaps resulting from it, my own health is causing me serious anxiety. It seems impossible for me to get a decent night's rest, even with the sedative that Corbett prescribed. My sleep is constantly broken by the most hideous nightmares, and one of which last night I even dreamt that I was accompanying Harper on one of his nocturnal escapades. The beginning of the dream remains utterly chaotic, but I distinctly remember standing in a field over the corpse of a woman whom he had dismembered. Though I could not see the man distinctly, he seemed to be constantly at my side, compelling me to busy myself, hiding the traces of his handiwork. As often, I believe, happens in dreams when we do things as a matter of course that are completely foreign to our nature, I felt myself lacking all volition to resist Harper's influence and, in fact, quite entering into the spirit of his requirements. I buried the woman's clothes in a ditch, covering them carefully with earth and dead bracken, and arranged parts of the body on a gate, balancing the head on one post and hanging the limbs in a row on the bars. The rest of the nightmare is like a fogged photographic plate, save that I repeated my former impression of tramping great distances with a heavy burden, in this instance a nude female torso. Such ghastly dreams must indicate some kind of ill health, and if Corbett cannot stop them, I shall consult a specialist. Later. Jobson has just come back from the village with fresh news which, to me at any rate, appears horribly significant. Another woman's head and limbs have been found, balanced on a gate dividing 2 nearby pastures. Jobson's description corresponds unpleasantly with my dream. Is it possible that I am somehow spiritually en rapport with Harper's ghost, through the medium of a common dwelling-place? I have never imagined myself in the least psychic. And then, how explain the finding of an actual corpse, or at any rate parts of one, in view of Harper's decease? No, obviously a different maniac, but with similar tendencies, must be at large, and I do not see why the aura of Harper's possession should bring me in touch with him, unless perhaps there is some malignant elemental native to these parts which prompts the killings and which may, to some extent, influence anybody living locally. But this is too wild a speculation. I have never believed in such things. Jobson, by the way, found a telegram for him at the post office telling him of a sister's illness. He is a sterling friend and servant, so I told him that he must, of course, take a few days off to see her. He demurred at first on the ground that I should be unable to get local help, but I could see he really wanted to go. He has accordingly left to catch a late train, and I have the house to myself. November 27th. Another outrage last night, and another nightmare for me. This time it is Miss Sims, the postmistress, whose remains were found on her own counter by her daily help, who arrives to make early tea at 7 o'clock. The unfortunate woman can have had no chance to resist her attackeress. Though she had neighbours on both sides, no outcry was heard. The trunk, as usual, had been carried off. Whether my nightmare had, again, any connection with this crime, I cannot recall. I am only aware of the sensation, to which I have now grown accustomed, of carrying things about and of being a fugitive. Towards morning, however, I had an amazingly vivid dream to the effect that I came down the stairs from an upper floor at present disused, entered the bathroom, and carefully washed my hands and feet, without, for some reason, turning on the light. This recollection came back as soon as I opened my eyes, and, being convinced that I had been guilty of actual sleepwalking on at least one previous occasion, I went at once to the bathroom to look for traces of my suspected earlier visit. But nothing turned out to be disarranged, and I was left in doubt until, after preparing and eating a light breakfast, I decided to explore the upstairs rooms. One of the first things to catch my eye was a black tassel, similar to those of my pajama girdles, projecting from under a locked door. I remember having seen the key to this door hanging in a cupboard under the main staircase, but on going to get it found it had disappeared, and I am now forced to a conclusion that I hate to face. Apart from the evidence of somnambulism, which in itself I resent as a weakness, I cannot overlook the connection between my dreams and the nightly butchery that is being enacted. Is it conceivable that, in my sleeping state, I have been actually present at one or more of these murders, and even, dreadful thought, handled the dismembered cadavers? My whole mind shrinks from this theory, but it is otherwise hard to explain the subconscious urge to wash, the locking up of a possibly stained pajama suit, and the hiding of the keys. Good God, I must be under hypnotic suggestion, and if I am seen and recognized in this state, I shall be thought guilty of the actual crimes themselves. It has occurred to me that my bad nights may be due to excessive smoking, for I have lately been inseparable from my, or rather Harper's, Meerschaum. To test this, I shall abstain from it tonight, and make do with a couple of cigarettes. November 28th. It is finished, and the Meerschaum pipe is burnt in the largest fire I could build into my grate. I only write this last page of my diary for the sake of my next of kin, to assure them that, whatever my own condition, there is no hereditary taint. The pipe alone was to blame. When my writing is done, I shall go out into the grounds and shoot myself under God's clean, daylit sky. I stuck to my intention of smoking nothing stronger than cigarettes, and for the first time in a week passed the early hours of the night in untroubled repose. Later, however, the restlessness must have returned, for a falling log awoke me to find myself sitting by the study fire, smoking the Meerschaum. As I came to full consciousness, I experienced the sudden waning of an abstract horror, indefinable but intense. It passed so quickly, though, that within a few seconds I doubted its very existence. Everything seemed normal. The room was still comfortably warm, and I felt too wide awake to seek my bed at once. Instead, I said aloud and quite cheerfully, "Well, if my sleepwalking only brings me down here for a smoke, there's no great harm done." And as the Meerschaum was drawing satisfactorily, I decided to sit up and finish it. If only I'd suspected and burned the damnable thing then. An habitual smoker always derives a soothing effect from puffing at a pipe, and it was the marked superiority of the Meerschaum in this respect that had attached me to it so strongly. Now, within a few moments, so pleasant a drowsiness crept over me that I heaped more logs on the fire, determined to finish the night where I sat, rather than risk finally arousing myself by a journey back to bed. But if sleep came back, and it did heavily, it was not the revitalizing, dreamless slumber that I wanted, but a fantastic string of the disjointed nightmare scenes in which I was constantly hunted from place to place by unseen pursuers and carrying in my arms a naked torso. At length these visions gave way to a sort of silent, oppressive darkness, and that in turn to pictures of my own earlier life, so that I shook off the menace of the former and looked happily at sane and wholesome things. I forgot that Mary had long been dead, and thought that she lay beside me in our old room at Hampstead. She was asleep, to judge by her quietness, and I had just awakened, but she lay very still in my arms. I bent my head forward and tried to touch her face with my lips, but it eluded me, and with an effort I opened my eyes. I was back in my own bed at Heronay, and of course there was no face on the pillow beside me. Yet I did indeed hold something in my arms, down under the bedclothes, something that felt like the body of a woman, but was very cold and still. I slid my feet out of the bed, sideways, without turning back the sheet. The missing bunch of keys lay on my pedestal cupboard, but I shall not belatedly explore that upper room. I know too well what it contains. Mr. Ash's Studio by H.R. Wakefield. It was the return of the road-breaking battalion, with their accursed compressed air drills, which made Mr. Horrocks's greying hairs bristle with determination. He could oathfully endure the foul orchestra of horns and gears, the cacophony of canned dance music, even the piano pounding of the infernal brat in the flat below. But at the first renewal of that quivering, booming patter from East Street, he knew something must be done if he was to finish his novel. "Why not take a studio while you're looking for another flat?" said a friend in the club. He picked up a copy of The Connoisseur. "Here you are. Within 10 minutes' walk of Knightsbridge Tube Station, roomy, outdoor studio. Very quiet, easy terms. Why not have a look at that? There are heaps of others vacant if it doesn't suit you." Very occasionally, about twice a year, Mr. Horrocks acted with extreme decision. Within 10 minutes, he was on his way to the agent's. He was a small, sturdy, thrusting little person of 46. He had a long head, rather flat along the top, the hair at the sides brushed forward, which gave him a slightly old-fashioned appearance. His eyes were very quick and dark, mouth small and mobile, chin pointed but emphatic. He made a rather contradictory impression on the discerning beholder, alert but contemplative, irascible but benign. He regarded censors, killjoys, Puritans and that sort with an unbridled loathing in theory, but if he came in actual contact with one of them, he was in practice, courteous, understanding, reasonable, inquisitive, the true novelist's mind being inevitably time-serving. "Anyone in Ruper's Court will direct you," said the agent, handing him a key. "Ask for Mr. Ash's studio." "Thank you," replied Mr. Horrocks and trotted off. Keeping a wary eye open, he eventually discovered Ruper's Court, which began in a narrow arched passageway off the Brompton Road, and developed into what had been known in his youth as a mews. Now, it was a series of lock-up garages and an occasional small private house, rebuilt coachmen's quarters. There were many chauffeurs saluting and attending to their charges. Mr. Horrocks, looking round for a guide, caught sight of a tall young man standing at the door of a charming little yellow house with gay blue window boxes. Mr. Horrocks went up to him and put his question. "Certainly," he replied in a pleasant, genial way. "Come with me." He conducted Mr. Horrocks to an opening on the right-hand side, round a corner where was a small square railed-in grass space. At the far end was a rather high hut with a corrugated iron roof, over which leaned a plane tree with many drooping branches. "That's the studio," said the tall young man. "The door is up the other end." "Thanks very much," said Mr. Horrocks. "It looks nice and quiet." The young man seemed to be considering something. "Are you a painter?" he asked presently. "No," replied Mr. Horrocks. "I try to write. My name is Samuel Horrocks, but I don't suppose you've ever heard of it." "Of course I have, and may I say I greatly admire your stories of the supernatural. May I ask how you were put on to this studio?" "Oh, I just happened to see it advertised." The young man remained thoughtful for a moment. Then he appeared to make up his mind. "Well," he said, "I hope you'll find it all right for your purposes. My name is Landon, and I live in that little yellow house. If I can be of any service to you, let me know." Mr. Horrocks thanked him, and they said good-bye. "A very courteous young fellow," thought Mr. Horrocks, as he stepped forward. "Looks highly intelligent, too, but I wonder what service he thought he could render me." Ah, there was the door. He pushed the key in the lock. He had to use some force to open the door, as it was jammed from damp, he supposed, at the bottom and sides. He found himself in a room surprisingly more spacious than its exterior suggested. There appeared to be 2 rooms, as a matter of fact, for there was another door at the far end. The place was lit by 3 high windows. It smelled rather fusty, and there were patches of damp on the distempered walls. There was an easel with a picture on it, and a couple of rather dilapidated chairs. He'd see what was behind the other door. It was another room, quite a small one, full of odds and ends, packing cases, an oil stove, a kettle, and so on. What a peculiar smell! What was that red stain on the small packing case? He bent down. Good heavens, it was alive! A cluster of moths. How very curious. Beautiful color. They must be feeding on something. He put out his hand to disturb them when suddenly they all sprang up at his face. Little brutes. He lashed out at them and beat a hasty retreat, shutting the door behind him. Venomous little beasts. Well, what about this studio? He wasn't greatly taken with it, but it was most certainly quiet. Mr. Horrocks was a shop assistant's glad dream, for he almost invariably took the first thing offered him and hurried out of the shop. The last thing he wanted was to go hunting about, fussing with agents and keys and asking his way and that sort of thing. He wanted a place to work in, and he wanted it at once. This would surely do. Not in the winter, perhaps, but with the summer coming on, why not in the winter? Mr. Horrocks vaguely considered this proviso. Too damp, perhaps, and also, well, there was something rather somber about it. It was the contrast, no doubt, between its aloofness, quietness, and isolation, and the raging stress and promiscuous din only 100 yards away. Something like that. Oh, yes, it would do. He'd get a desk in and a stove for the damp and just exploit that aloofness and quiet. That was settled. He strolled over to the easel. Portrait of a woman. Good-looking girl, in a way very beautiful, and yet there was something about her expression, something enigmatic. Wonder who this fellow Ash was. There were his palette and brushes on the floor behind the easel. Curious smudged, rainbow thing, a palette. It was rather humiliating, but he hadn't really the smallest knowledge of the way a painter went to work. However, he'd never pretended otherwise. How loud his footsteps sounded on the wood floor showed how quiet it was. Before leaving, he peeped through the door into the small room. Yes, there they were, back again, forming a sort of pattern. Wonderful patch of colour, dark ruby. Little brutes seemed to be staring at him. He laughed out loud. What an echo! He must get some lunch. He'd take the studio that afternoon for a month. That was settled, and a great relief. As he caught hold of the door on getting outside, it seemed to swing hard at him of its own momentum, and it slammed harshly, thrusting him back. He was a little ruffled. Not exactly a hospitable atmosphere about that place, he thought. The tall young man was still standing outside the yellow house as he repassed up the court. "Well?" he asked. "I've decided to take it," said Mr. Horrocks. "It's not perhaps a very cheerful spot, but its quietness decided me." The young man nodded. "Are you taking it for long?" "No, just by the month." "I see. Well, good luck with the book. I hope you'll give us some more ghost stories soon." "It's rather difficult to get plots for them," replied Mr. Horrocks. "But I'll do my best. Good morning." 3 days later he revisited the studio, which now housed a desk, a couple of comfortable chairs, and his portable typewriter. It was a brilliantly fine May morning, and the place seemed a bit more genial, but not really very much, he considered. However, now for work. He was about a third of the way through his novel and irritatingly uncertain exactly how to develop it. Also, he had promised his agent to have a ghost story ready fairly soon for the Christmas number of a magazine, which paid very well. But at the moment he hadn't an idea in his head. For the time being, he would concentrate on the novel. He sat down at his desk and began to cogitate. His weakness, he knew it well, was a tendency to flippancy. The more he saw and read of the world and its denizens, the harder he found it to take them with the proper seriousness. As far as the tale of humanity was concerned, he was inclined to laugh at the wrong places, a serious flaw in a novelist. His characters would adopt an unbecoming impishness at critical moments and mock their creator's efforts to control them. It was probably due to the fact that their creator had never succeeded in measuring humanity flatteringly in accordance with the cosmic scale. He was, therefore, delighted to find that the atmosphere of Mr. Ashe's studio was an excellent corrective to this levity. He wrote a whole chapter by lunchtime, a very critical chapter, and he knew that it was good. The motley streak was rigidly eliminated from it. With an arching arm but satisfied soul, he got up at 1:30, yawned, stretched himself, and found himself regarding the picture on the easel. Seen by this stronger light, it appeared a very vivid piece of work. It almost seemed as if it had been more worked on than when he'd seen it before. Certainly her face was a puzzle. He went up to it and covered first her eyes, then her mouth and chin with his hand, in an attempt to discover where the secret of that oddness lay. As a result, he decided it was imminent and not to be traced. He'd have a look and see what those little red devils were doing. They were there, bunched on the packing case, making that same pattern, motionless and intent. Funny pattern, almost like a human face. Vague memories of bug hunting at school came back to him. He was very certain that nothing resembling them had ever found its way into his killing bottle. Singular markings on their heads. He bent down, and at once the swarm rose together and flew savagely into his face. He struck out at them. How extraordinary. It seemed impossible to touch one. Artful little dodgers. What a filthy smell they made, nauseating and corrupt. He'd leave them alone in future. He spent the afternoon at Kew Gardens, in his opinion the most delectable place in the world on a fine spring day. As he strolled about the lawns and threw crumbs to the birds, he sought some inspiration for that infernal ghost story. A reviewer had once credited him with the possession of a malignant imagination for such fiction. At the moment, he had a malignant lack of it. All the same, the atmosphere of that studio ought to be kinetic. Presently, he felt like a rest and sat down on a seat by the rhododendrons. Drowsily, he began to daydream. A succession of images elusively patrolled his brain. A girl's head on an easel, a dark stain on a packing case. He found himself examining the studio, almost inch by inch, for his visualizing power was very highly developed. He scrutinized the girl's face closely, and then was jerked back into full consciousness, for it had seemed to him that a brush had fallen on the face and slightly emphasized the line from her left nostril to upper lip. Amusing illusion. Might be an idea for a story there. Whole thing taking place in narrator's subconscious. Damned difficult. Well, he must be getting home. Those road breakers would have knocked off by the time he reached there. From then on, he went to the studio 4 days a week, always in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. He invariably approached it with oddly mixed emotions. Never had he known any place more stimulating to his imagination, yet he never felt at home there. The moment he unlocked the door, he felt a sense of obscure excitement, which in fact began to come over him as soon as he passed into Ruper's Court, and intensified itself until he was actually inside and face to face with the girl on the easel. And as he wrote, he often paused and looked up at her. Each time he came to the studio, she seemed subtly and indefinably to have changed, developed, become at once more realized, yet harder to nail down and analyze. He imagined that was what was meant by learning to see a painting, that like a poem or a piece of music, it only revealed its inner, profounder meaning to those who lavished as much care on deciphering it as the artist had in inscribing it. She was very useful, too, for she seemed to have become identified in a way with the chief female character in his novel. Heroine would have been a somewhat satirical term for that dark-hearted vampire. And how excellently and reassuringly the book was going. For once his publisher's plaintive and oft-repeated blurbed insistence that Samuel Horrocks' latest work is also his greatest showed every evidence of being justified. Certainly it revealed an almost ruthless lack of flippancy. As it moved to its inevitable climax, the shadows darkened and gathered round it. That meant drastically revising the first third of it, a laborious necessity but unescapable. He left the little room and the moths alone. Their business was none of his, he felt, and somehow they were peculiar to the place. He gathered that Mr. Ashe, whoever he might be, had felt a keen interest in them, for he discovered a little sketchbook, presumably his, on one of the window ledges. This contained dozens of preliminary studies for the girl's head, each one decoratively framed in moth clusters. One of them gave him rather a dubious reaction, for the girl's head was flung hard back from her shoulders, and there was poured over her face a stream of dark red, delicately though unmistakably articulated into the couched shape of moths. What the artist was thinking about when he put his pencil to work on so morbid a conception, Mr. Horrocks was at a loss to understand, yet it fascinated him, and he several times examined it in a hurried, shamefaced way. All the same, if it hadn't been someone else's property, he was almost certain he would have torn it into very small pieces. He spent perhaps 20 hours a week in the studio, yet in a sense he was there for much longer. That was due to his recently developed tendency to daydream, reinforced by his abnormal power of visualization. This tendency was by no means welcome. In fact, it was decidedly exasperating, for his subconscious, the breeding ground, he supposed, of these daydreams, appeared to be quite determined that he should be compelled to take an urgent interest in what occurred at the studio when its tenant wasn't there. Of course, nothing went on, And yet the fact remained that he might be taking a walk or trying to read, when all of a sudden he would find himself, as it were, just inside the studio and regarding its interior. His view of it was hazy, and it appeared much diminished, but it was quite recognizable. He couldn't see his desk or chairs, but there was the girl's head on the easel, and there the windows and the door into the little room. And he was forced to admit there was frequently something else, someone to be more precise, and that he, yes, it was a man, was moving about. A tall man with an odd walk, as if he limped. But however hard he concentrated, he could never quite get this person into focus. The effort to do so often made him sweat and his heart race, but he simply couldn't get a proper look at this person's face. Surely he was tall and dark. Who could he be? While he was still in this fussed state, and before he pulled himself together and called himself a fool, he often felt a violent, crazy impulse to dash off to Rupert's Court to make quite certain whether there was or was not someone prowling about the studio. More than once he could only just rally enough strength of mind to resist this insensate craving. He reassured himself that this eccentric preoccupation with a dingy hut was a symptom of overwork. Not exactly that, perhaps, but excessive absorption in his novel. But how blessed that all those wavering, uncertain currents had coalesced so perfectly into a steady stream. He had to thank the dingy hut for that, and he could see the end in sight. He met London when he was leaving the studio late one afternoon, and accepted his invitation to come in for a glass of sherry. The little yellow house was as charming inside as out, fitted and furnished with a nice, careless discretion. "So you really find the place a congenial workshop?" his host inquired on hearing of the progress the book was making. "Well, it depends on what you mean by that," replied Mr. Horrocks. "I've certainly written 40,000 words there, and as golfers say, I don't want them back. But congenial, well, I mustn't be ungrateful, but it's not an adjective I feel appropriate to the place." Landon was silent for a moment. "No," he said presently, "I think I understand what you mean." "You've been inside it?" "Oh, yes," said Landon. "It's got an atmosphere of its own, almost one might say a personality. There are places like that, I think. Are you clairvoyant in that way? I mean, have you had actual experiences of a psychic sort?" "As a matter of fact, I have," replied Mr. Horrocks. "Quite a number. But as I found that these experiences were not shared by others, I've kept quiet about them." "That is my case also," said Landon. "And I've learnt to keep my mouth shut. When to open it results in being regarded as a self-assertive liar. It must be a great relief to you to get them out of your system in the form of fiction. Are you writing a story now?" Mr. Horrocks shrugged his shoulders. "I'm not sure," he said, "but I'm inclined to think there is one forming itself in my harassed old pate, but I mustn't hurry it or keep pulling it up to have a look like an impatient fisherman. If it's hooking something, I shall feel that unmistakable bite when the time comes." "That's rather a revealing metaphor," said Landon. "I can't write fiction, think of stories myself. I'm an architect, but I understand just what you mean. By the way, I always remember that story of yours, At the Going Down of the Sun. I believe the ray theory of psychic phenomena you hinted at there is the most probable." "It was the undoubted evidence for phantoms of the living which gave me the idea," replied Mr. Horrocks, somewhat gratified. "Yes, quite," said Landon. "By the way, you don't work at night in the studio, do you?" "I haven't so far." "Well, I shouldn't. There are some tough characters about this neighborhood at night. If they saw a light, they might pay you a somewhat unceremonious visit." "I should, of course, lock the door," said Mr. Horrocks. "Yes, naturally, but all the same I shouldn't run any risk." At length the day came when Mr. Horrocks typed the word "Finis" and the date below it, May 29th, and knew that the preceding 90,000 words represented the best work he'd done in his life. so good and yet so alien to his customary manner both in atmosphere and style, that he hardly recognized it as his. Almost, he modestly said to himself, as if he'd been a tiny bit inspired. Tomorrow he'd hand it to his publisher and go straight off to Cornwall for a long rest. And then he'd start hunting for a tolerably quiet flat. So it was goodbye to the studio. Would he be sorry to bid it farewell? Once again he failed to give a decided answer to that question. It had been a most excellent tonic and stimulant to his imagination, yet he was a little afraid of it. Yes, better to say the word. There was something about it which ruffled his nerves and no doubt caused that ridiculous yet oppressive daydreaming. He'd have a last leisurely stroll round it and a last look at the girl. It really was a most baffling illusion, for he could have sworn that the expression on her face had drastically changed. She was still exquisitely beautiful, and she'd always looked like one to be wary of, but now she wore an air of mocking, heartless frigidity, a most lovely, perilous vampire. A devil. He had a sudden desire to crash his fist into her face, and then he laughed at himself and said out loud, "Well, my most adorable but evil one, I shan't see you again. Give my love to Mr. Ashe and—" He stopped abruptly. He had spoken in a light, bantering tone, but the echo of his words came back to him in a most mournful yet somehow mocking way. He felt a sudden gust of uneasiness and depression and impulsively turned the canvas round. On the back of it, he casually noticed some carefully drawn but undecipherable hieroglyphics. And now for a last look at the little red beasts. Yes, there they were, glowing, motionless, and obscene, like a stain of blood with 100 eyes. Supposing he picked up that piece of planking and crashed it down on them. The little devils seemed to read his thoughts, for they sprang up at him and drove him from the room. How they stank! Well, that was that. As he opened the door to leave, he took a last look back, and then the door swung hard at him, runk, and slammed to. As he strolled towards his club for lunch, his mind turned to the subject of that infernal ghost story he'd got to write. It was beginning to get urgent. Obscurely, he felt that the studio was the only possible place in which to conceive of it and write it. Perhaps he'd given it up too soon. What a curse it was! Just as he'd finished a most delicate and exhausting piece of work, he'd got to tackle another. Well, he would have one day off, he told himself irritably. If his imagination wouldn't let him rest, he'd drown it. The bank rate had been lowered that morning, and his business friends at the club, who'd been feeling the overdraft severely, were in the mood for some alcoholic enthusiasm and celebration. Mr. Horrocks was reasonably abstemious, but for once he found their spiritual state catching and comforting. Consequently, after a large and cheerful lunch, sherry, hock, and a double port, he was more than prepared for a restorative snooze in his favourite chair in the chess-room. It was sweet and dreamless, so he was all the more annoyed when on awaking he found himself staring not at the trees in St. James's Park, but straight down the length of the studio. And there was that. No, he wouldn't look. He got up brusquely and went to the bar. He completely mistrusted the Fata Morgana amenities of alcohol, but his nerves were jangled and something must be done. He did it with discretion. The result was quite unexpected and bizarre, for he began to experience an exalted resolve to visit the studio again that night, and then and there conceive of that accursed short story. He was sure of it. He'd have a good dinner, just enough to keep his optimism untarnished, but leave his head fairly clear, and he'd get that story. It sounded ludicrous, but he'd had such irrational surges of certainty before, and they'd always been justified. He would go. Successfully maintaining his resolution and good hope, he hailed a taxi at 10:30, and 20 minutes later was at Rupert's Court, feeling rather excited and venturous. Yet the enterprise began to reveal itself rather more starkly in the court than it had in the club's smoking room. It was a boisterous night, the wind veering to the west and stiffening sharply. The weather was breaking, and with much low cloud it was very dark. Rupert's Court appeared desolate and uninviting. Lander seemed to be in, as there was a light in his sitting room. This reminded Mr. Horrocks of his advice about not visiting the studio after dark. Oh well, he could take care of himself. As he turned the corner, he took an electric torch from his pocket. That tree made it damned dark. What a wind! Curious sound the branches made on the roof, like stealthy footsteps. There was the keyhole. Door had stuck as usual. He put his shoulder to it, whereupon it yielded so suddenly that he staggered forward and dropped the torch. Then the door swung back and crashed. Now where was that cursed torch? His hand swept the floor. There it was. Click, click. Blast the thing, it wouldn't work now. Yes, just a faint glow. He'd wait a moment till his eyes got used to it. Rather a fool to have come. What was he really doing in this rather dreadful place? How those branches lashed the roof. Yes, really rather a dreadful place. What would those moths be doing? Probably just making that pattern and listening to him, their foul little eyes staring and intent. He moved forward cautiously. He could just see his way now. What a daunting suggestion of menace seemed hovering in the place. Well, that was an absurd exaggeration. After all, that was the atmosphere he'd come to absorb. Hello? What was that? It almost seemed as if the room had become smaller, as if the walls had come crouching in towards him. There was the easel. But he turned the girl's face round. Who could have— Good God, the moths were on it! He stood motionless and rigid, his heart beating wildly. For wasn't her head flung back from the shoulders, and weren't they crawling? And weren't those walls closing in on him? And who was that standing and watching him from the small door? For a moment he felt he could never move again. Then he wrenched himself free and began to run for the door. He dropped the torch and with trembling hands groped his way along a wall. Where was the door? Was that it? No! Yes! As he flung it open, it seemed as though a myriad little wings came beating round his eyes. He tore down the path, the door crashing to behind him. As he reached the corner, someone approached him. He flinched back. Then a voice said, "It's all right. This is London. You're perfectly safe. Come with me." "But how did you know?" cried Mr. Horrocks hysterically. "I heard you shouting," he replied quietly, "and guessed the rest." Mr. Horrocks walked panting by his side to his house and into the sitting room. There was a tantalus and glasses on the table. "Sit down," said Landon, "and make yourself comfortable while I mix you a drink." "It's very good of you," said Mr. Horrocks. "I'm afraid I quite lost my head, but I had rather a shock. See now, I should have taken your advice, but I didn't realize." "Perhaps I should have been more explicit," replied Landon, handing him a glass. "But as you found the place congenial for your writing, I didn't want to prejudice you against it. But it is, of course, well, shall we say, highly impregnated. You've gone into such matters far more than I, but as you have stated, they remain without convincing explanation." "Absolutely so," replied Mr. Horrocks, raising his glass with a still unsteady hand. "Any tentative suggestions I have made were simply guesswork. There is no theory ever advanced which begins to cover the ground. It was horrible, horrible." "I'll give you such facts as I know about that studio," said Landon, sitting down and lighting a cigarette. "It was built by a person named Raphael Ash 4 years ago. His father was a Highland Scot in business at Tehran. There he married a Persian woman of high degree. Their son was brought up in Persia and eventually sent to Oxford. A friend of mine was up at New College with him. He was a very enigmatic character, outwardly imperturbable and bland, yet keeping himself aloof from college life and somehow forbidding. He was extremely unpopular for some reason, I believe, not unconnected with a certain doubt as to how he spent his plentiful leisure time. The occupants of the other rooms in his corridor thought at times they saw and heard somewhat dubious things. So, 4 enterprising and intoxicated sportsmen broke into his rooms one night. They got rather badly frightened, but would say nothing of their experiences. By a coincidence, they all died within a year or so. Ash came under the notice of the college authorities and was sent down by them after a couple of terms for reasons best known to themselves. Whereupon he built this studio and began to paint. He also fell in love. I may say he inherited a great deal of money. The lady concerned seemed for a time to reciprocate his feelings, and she certainly made his money fly. However, someone else desired her, and he was just as rich and socially far more eligible. I knew this lady, and you have seen a brilliantly clever likeness of her, but no portrait could do her justice. She was exquisitely lovely, an accomplished actress, and an utterly amoral, soulless rogue. Well, she married the other man and went to live with him at his place in Surrey. A few weeks later, she met her death. She was seen one afternoon by a gamekeeper running through a wood near the house. He stated at the inquest that she was beating out at something with her hands. He imagined she was being attacked by a swarm of bees and ran after her. But before he could reach her, she had fallen over the edge of a quarry. She was dying when he got to her, but still beating out with her hands as if to keep something from her face. Shortly after, Ash was shot dead in the small room in the studio. "Good God!" exclaimed Mr. Horrocks. "Was it suicide?" "That was the verdict," replied Landon slowly. The evidence was slightly conflicting. One witness stated that he had heard voices coming from the studio that afternoon, and the medical evidence was slightly indefinite. However, the coroner was satisfied. "Well, that's all I know about Mr. Ash and his studio, or almost. When I came to live here, I discovered it had a certain reputation amongst the frequenters of the court. I wondered why, got the key, and went there late one winter evening. And then I no longer wondered. It has had one temporary tenant beside you since Ash died. He gave it up after a few days. I believe it is to be pulled down soon. And now you must have another little drink, and I'll join you." "Well, just a very small one. There is one other thing. Those moths." "You will not find their like in the Natural History Museum," replied Landon. "Perhaps you might search the world over and never do so. For I once described them to a distinguished Orientalist, and he told me that he had never met anyone who had encountered such an insect, but that he'd received obscure hints concerning such creatures, though there was a very general reluctance to refer to them. Once or twice he had succeeded in overcoming this reluctance. He gathered that they were known as the servants of Eblis in a rough translation. Personally, he didn't believe in their existence and was greatly puzzled as to how I'd heard of them. I will tell you something. You and one other are the only persons I've known who could see them." "Who could see them?" echoed Mr. Horrocks, astonished. "Yes, I have made some experiments. You and I, in that respect at least, are privileged people." "And that other?" asked Mr. Horrocks, after a pause. "She is dead," replied Landon quietly. Mr. Horrocks was silent for a while. Presently he said, "Was Ash very dark, and did he limp slightly?" "Yes," replied Landon. The Man Who Made Faces by C.P. Howard. 1. Deception is the game of the mask maker, barked Nigel Jones, addressing the smattering of students before him. Keep this in mind as we move forward. The lecture hall was a modest one, but still his words echoed from wall to wall, emphasizing the failure of his cause. Jones was an artist, a man of passion and ambition, and yet there he was, straddling the void between poverty and the dream, incapable of sparking the imaginations of 12 heavy-lidded teenagers. In one hand, his dominant hand, he held a plain papier-mâché mask, its empty eyes staring at the floor. This, he continued, raising the mask after the fashion of an Olympic medal, is where your journey begins. The blank canvas, as it were. The face, a face, any face. The sound of his own voice irritated him, made him irrationally self-conscious. His cheeks burned with an uncharacteristic flush. Linda Wallace noticed the blush, and Jones saw that she noticed. This only intensified the sensation, his eyes remaining on the young lady a fraction of a second too long, a fraction of a second coloured by an expression not fit for a man in his position. Any face, Jones repeated, unaware that Mike Bennett had caught the awkward exchange and was silently fuming. After all, Wallace was Bennett's girl. There wasn't a chance in hell he was going to let a dumpy lecturer double his age, leer at her, and get away with it. So we skip ahead a couple of hours, to the unfortunate moment Nigel Jones is making his way across the school car park when he's accosted by an enraged Mike Bennett. Bennett's a big lad, with big arms and big hands, and has no trouble whatsoever in grabbing Jones by the shoulders and pushing him to the ground. Jones has barely opened his mouth in protest when Bennett's on top of him, a raging mass silhouetted by the harsh glare of the street lamp above. He's pummeling Jones, fists rising and falling like sledgehammers striking stone, pounding jaw, cheekbone, nose, and head with alarming brutality. "You fucking pervert," Bennett spits, kicking him now. "Don't you ever look at her like that again." But Jones is in no position to respond. He's bewildered, overwhelmed, throbbing from head to toe, his thoughts a jumble. He glimpses one final fist falling like a boulder from a cliff before he's knocked into oblivion. Mike Bennett stumbled out of a backstreet bar, drunk and disorderly. 5 years had passed following the attack on his former teacher, Nigel Jones, and life hadn't been good to him. Linda Wallace had long since abandoned him, as had his prospects for further education. He'd turned to booze at the tender age of 19, and by 23 was a hopeless alcoholic. Eruptions of violence were commonplace, often landing him behind bars for days at a time. Ironically, no punishment had followed his terrible assault on Jones. He'd left the hapless figure broken and bleeding on the cold ground, heedless of the extent of the wounds he'd inflicted, retreating to his lair in the basement of his parents' home, his heavy fists bruised and aching, stained with blood. And there he'd remain for some time, awaiting the inevitable knock at the door, a knock that, as luck would have it, never came. Clandestine inquiries were made, and it transpired that, of course, Jones had been admitted to hospital, and, as a result of his injuries, had fallen into a coma. The attack occurred outside of the range of closed-circuit television, and there were no witnesses, and so, in effect, Mike Bennett had got away with it, for the time being at least. He certainly wouldn't be turning himself in at the nearest police station. But he felt no joy, no reprieve, just a severe ramping up of latent rage, poorly restrained by drink and drugs. After a while, talk of Nigel Jones and his whereabouts disappeared from the rumour mill, but the thought of what might have become of him haunted Bennett. The big lad fell into a spiral of destructive behaviors, fueled by nightmare visions involving the collapsing face of Jones, a face once round and pudgy, now gaunt and deformed, nose broad and flat, oozing blood, eyes like slots, black and bulging, lips like dinghies, cheeks like pancakes. And it was such an image that filled his intoxicated brain as he staggered across the road, narrowly avoiding the late afternoon traffic, navigating the winding streets of the city, in search of the flat above MS News. Outside the flat, his home for the last 2 years, Mark Sugar, the proprietor of the newsagents over which his humble abode floated, popped his skinny head out of the shop and handed Bennett a package. "Parcel for you," Sugar said in his inimitable way, a voice at once dull and shrill. "Postie dropped it this morning." "Cheers," Bennett slurred, clutching the unexpected delivery. In the small living room of his flat, Bennett, his head spinning and unsteady on his feet, inspected the contents of the package. He paid no mind to the poorly handwritten address on the top of the small box, quickly discarding it, as his eyes fell on what lay within. It was a papier-mâché mask. In spite of his inebriation, Bennett recognized the crude depiction of his own face, squinted at it and scowled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The mask scowled back, the empty eye-holes bottomless pits, its lips downturned in mocking tragedy. His pock-marked complexion had been captured, the surface of the mask coarse and uneven, hideous to the touch. Ghastly though the thing was, Bennett found himself captivated by it, wanting to understand its purpose, even as he rocked back and forth involuntarily on the spot. Then and there he knew the creator of the mask was sending a message he wasn't sure he wanted to fully comprehend. But things were only going to get stranger for the young drunk. The arrival of the papier-mâché mask had a profound effect on Mike Bennett. He stopped drinking, found himself a job, tidied up the car boot sale dumping ground that was his flat. On some level, the sardonic stare of that molded face had touched his soul, impressing him with its muted disparagement. To be in its presence was to suffer belittlement, and it seemed that the only way to overcome it was to dispense with his vices. And with each lifestyle change he made, be it the casting aside of booze or the procurement of employment, the expression the mask wore seemed to soften somewhat, like an obsessive parent subtly impressed by their offspring's exemplary progress at school. The staring black eyes receded, the lips threatened to turn upwards, the abrasive surface smoothed out. The face was altogether brighter, rejuvenated. I think it has to be said that these apparent transformations might have been merely the result of changes in lighting. The mask seen under the glare of the television, the intrusive dazzle of the moon, the soft glow of several standard lamps. But this was a conception that Bennett never once considered. For a time thereafter, the young man approached the status of an even-tempered, measured individual with a grip on life's basic necessities. He looked back on his former habits with disdain, regretted his actions deeply. And it was during these morbid reflections that his thoughts frequently returned to the violent attack on Nigel Jones, as he struggled to reconcile old Bennett with the new one. What had become of Jones after his supposed coma? The man had simply disappeared from the surface of the planet, and this troubled Bennett, more so as he laid his eyes on the moulded face suspended from a panel pin in the living room, still none the wiser as to its origin. These contemplations made sleeping difficult, and he would lie there, tossing and turning, reliving his lowest moments. If only he could see Linda again, the one that got away. Had she ever really felt anything for him? Or had she always been hot for teacher, as he'd suspected? Such thoughts plagued the 17-year-old mind, particularly the troubled 17-year-old mind. She'd taken her leave shortly after the attack on Jones had become public knowledge. She'd never accused him directly, but the look on her face the moment she saw the dark bruises decorating his bloated knuckles said everything. No, he wouldn't be seeing Linda again. She'd fled for the hills. Or perhaps, he would think as he lay in bed, tormented by his former life, she'd gone off with Jones after all. It was quite possible the two had buggered off somewhere, overseas probably, in an effort to get as far away from their aggressor as possible. It was in these dire moments that Bennett would return to the present, acutely aware of the importance of looking forwards, not backwards. 2. Bennett first saw the stranger at work. He held a position as a shelf filler at a small supermarket, covering fresh produce. He worked the late shift, 2 through 10, which, as anybody who has ever worked in retail will attest, is probably the least desirable shift one can work. Bennett, however, was quite fond of the shift, finding the 7 through 10 portion especially interesting. Characters shopped after 7, those eccentric of dress and quiet of demeanor, illegitimate couples and guarded loners. He'd observed these shoppers as he stacked the shelves, intrigued by their furtive ways. The stranger was sighted towards the end of his shift one night, an individual incongruous with the other customers going about their late evening business. This shopper, espied at the opposite end of the aisle Bennett was working, stood stock still, seemingly watching him. The watcher was of average height and build, wearing a nondescript duffel coat, jeans, and dark boots. Male or female, Bennett couldn't be sure from where he stood, nor would it have mattered, for it was the impression of the watcher's face that caught his attention, a blank face, reminiscent of a slasher film antagonist, a white mask of which only the dark eye-holes were visible. Dark eye-holes, and the suggestion of a nose and mouth. Disheveled black hair tumbled from the crown, looking for all the world as unsettling and false as the face below it. Bennett twitched and shuffled on the spot, wanting to look away, but finding it impossible to do so. The watcher held his attention. There was something in that barely seen face that called to him, something of guile in those frozen features. He grinned, then winced, his own face betraying his befuddlement. Perhaps he would have confronted the stranger, had the standoff continued, but as it was, Bennett was approached by a customer in quest of yarrow, forcing him to move away. When finally he returned to the aisle, the watcher was gone, leaving him somewhat frustrated. Who or what had he seen? Just another solitary oddball? He scratched his head, puzzled. The faces he made. In the days that followed, there were further sightings of the stranger, each signaled by that sense of creeping flesh, the hairs on the back of the neck standing on end. Bennett was making his way through the center of town, in broad daylight, when he caught a glimpse of the watcher standing amongst a group at a bus stop. The duffel coat, jeans, and boots, but most notably the porcelain face, its dark eyes tracking his progress. Another time he was taking a shortcut across the park, where, standing quite conspicuously by the rusty swings of the abandoned children's play area, he saw the stranger again, adopting the same inanimate stance, watching him intently. Not even a trip to Wingate Hill to see his mother offered respite from the sensation of being observed, for standing at the far end of the cul-de-sac on which she lived, partially concealed by the wild canopy of a leaning tree, was the dreaded figure in its customary attire, waiting, watching. Bennett discussed the situation with his mother, escorting her in an understandably frantic fashion to the bay window in order to point out his would-be stalker. But, as had been the case with each and every sighting of the figure, a second glance revealed nothing at all. The watcher had vanished, just as it had at the supermarket, the bus stop, the children's play area. Mrs. Bennet was visibly disturbed by what her son was telling her, more so when he attempted to connect the sighting to Nigel Jones, the teacher he'd practically left for dead, on the empty grounds of the school. "He's taunting me, Mum," Bennet yammered. "He wants to get me back for what I did to him." "You don't even know what you did to him," Mrs. Bennet blurted, after which she covered her mouth with her hands, as if she'd revealed something unintentionally. "What?" Bennet said, rounding on her. "What do you mean?" "Forget it," she said. I shouldn't have said anything." "Wait a minute. If you know something, Mum, you have to tell me." Mrs. Bennet took a deep breath and sank into the armchair she'd been perched on. "I heard it through the grapevine," she began guiltily. "He was a mess, Mike. Severe facial trauma. We didn't hear about him because he didn't want anyone to hear about him. They took him down to London for reconstructive surgery. At least, that's what I was told." "Told? Who told you?" I can't remember," she stammered, shaking her head dismissively. "I think it was Harry Rice." Rice had been the school headmaster, probably still was for all Bennet knew. His mother went on to tell him that Rice had contacted her shortly after the attack. He'd spoken to Jones, who'd stated that Bennet was the culprit, but that he didn't want to press charges. "That always bothered me," Mrs. Bennet said. "Why wouldn't he want to press charges? Why take himself away?" The young man shook his head. He didn't like what he was hearing, not a bit of it. His strange stalker out there. Was it Jones after all, back for revenge? Was his girl to drive him insane? And what about the mask? The very mask that right at that moment was hanging on the wall of his living room. Was Jones responsible for that? Bennet shuddered. "Why don't we take a look at things from the other side? There's a room, a dark room, not too far from Bennet's flat above the paper shop. It's a temporary space, a base of operations, for want of a better phrase. A couple of lamps cast light on certain parts of the room. A pair of heavy-looking boots sit in the spotlight of one of them, and a cheap fiberboard desk rests under the glow of another. The desk is a workstation filled with materials, newspaper strips, a dozen paintbrushes, a bowl of water, bags of plain flour. It's a craftsman's setup, typically chaotic. 2 hands bind the materials. Flour is added to the water, mixed vigorously with a wooden spoon. The strips of newspaper are dipped in the mixture, then carefully added to a crude mold, the template from which a mask will be made. There are other masks in the dark room, many plain faces, some lost in shadow, others on the periphery of light. It's a strange place, a den born of obsession. The mask maker is mumbling now, uttering illegible obeisance to something present but unseen, something of shadow, buzzing between the lights. It's in the air, this thing, drifting from mask to mask, seeing through their eyes, studying the tangible world it desperately wishes to inhabit. "Bennet," we hear from lips that don't move. "Bennet," it repeats, in a low voice impossible to describe. The figure at the desk completes the task at hand, suspending the wet creation from a line above the workstation. Admiring its work, the figure takes a step back, into the waiting moor of the bodiless thing in the shadows. The touch of the thing is a laudatory caress. It is very pleased with the figure's latest creation. "Bennet," we hear once more, as our eyes are drawn to that glossy mask, the perfect likeness of a scowling, eyeless Mike Bennet. There isn't much more to tell. Mike Bennet's fate, it would seem, was determined by that violent outburst at the tender age of 17. And it was with thoughts of an indifferent universe, in whose galaxies, nebulae, stars, and planets continued their unconscious journeys, that Bennett returned to the confines of his little flat, his overwrought brain buzzing. The trip home had been arduous, a good 4-mile walk during which he felt eyes on him at regular intervals, black hollows that promised only annihilation. Waiting for him on the living-room wall was his papier-mâché likeness, its features contorted now by the glare of passing headlights, a seemingly endless stream of them. He saw the gamut of human emotions there, captured on paper. Anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and lastly surprise, an emotion he himself was now experiencing, owing to a glance out of the corner of his eye that had revealed the watcher outside, just across the street, looking up at him through the window, its blank gaze dazzling his senses. "Who are you?" he yelled at the glass, the sound absorbed by the double glazing. "What do you want from me?" And it smiled. The paper face of the watcher grinned, revealing a third cavernous void in addition to the 2 eye-holes. It was a dreadful thing to behold, at once plain and abstract, setting Bennett's hair on end like a charge of static. His hands went to the supercharged strands, yanking at them like foreign objects, shaking his head in astonishment. But the worst was yet to come. Bennett stumbled backwards, forcing himself to look away from the monstrosity outside, only to discover another grinning facade in his midst. The mask on the wall was leering at him now, in a crooked sneer that revealed teeth like his, but yellow and cracked, like the crumbling fangs of the elderly or disease-stricken. He tried to look away, but found that he couldn't. It was like looking into a mirror, forced to confront his imperfections, knowing full well that there was nothing he could do about them, trapped as he was by the mistakes he'd made, the risks he'd taken. "Mike," came a voice over his shoulder, a whisper like a breath of air. He spun around, coming face to face with the stranger standing there, a figure much smaller than himself, a figure possessing the unmistakable curves of a woman, curves somehow familiar to him. The duffel coat couldn't hide those lines, nor could the jeans, but try as he might, squinting and rubbing his eyes like a man drenched in pepper spray, he couldn't see the face of the stranger. It was a blur, a mass of achromatic shades, like the face of a criminal blurred out on television. Then up came the hands, the lithe, colourless hands, in a rapid groping at his face. They clawed at him, long nails scratching his skin, drawing blood almost instantly. He tried to defend himself, tried to stop the cat-like grazing, but he was powerless to prevent it. In a matter of seconds, the sharp claws had cut through the epidermis and dermis, and were making light work of the subcutaneous tissue, seeking muscle and bone. The scene was ghastly in the extreme, the walls of Bennett's living room fairly covered with blood, fats, and minerals. He wanted to scream, but found that he could only manage a strained groan, this due to the fact that his mouth was no longer a mouth, but a wide gash from ear to ear, from out of which flopped a lacerated tongue, split in two like the tongue of a lizard. But we needn't go on with the details of Bennett's awful defacement. Suffice it to say, his minutes were numbered. He slumped to the floor, his consciousness having retreated to minimum safe distance, watching the maniacal figure before his blood-smeared eyes from the end of a long and dark tunnel. As his last handful of breaths came and went, the face of his attacker was revealed. A mask was removed, the same blank face that had stalked him. But it wasn't Nigel Jones, nor was it a stranger. It was the clean, beautiful face of Linda Wallace. The faces she made. Mike Bennett's body was discovered 2 days later, after a number of calls placed by his mother and employer had gone unanswered. Police had found him in the living room of his flat, lying face down on the threadbare carpet. The cause of death was unable to be determined, as there was no evidence of physical injury, and, according to the medical examiner, Bennett had been a healthy young man, not suffering from any known disease, nor had he ingested anything that would have resulted in his untimely end. The only remarkable oddity in the room was the papier-mâché mask on the wall, a mask in Bennett's likeness, thoroughly shredded and hanging in tatters. A small penknife was found on the floor nearby. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,